And the secret among the creative community is that the X-Men fans are the deepest, darkest hole of the internet. You cannot make them happy. It's impossible. They don't know what they want, but they know they don't want that.
Listen to me. This conspiracy with the X-Men. Holy crap, what's going on? Every day someone asks me about why Marvel hates the X-Men.
It was such a daring deal, you know what I mean? Because it was one of those ideas when people heard about it, they were like, don't do that.
What's going to happen to Cyclops? What's going to happen to the all-new X-Men, the time-displaced X-Men?
Gold balls, really?
Gold balls, really? It's this amazing taco of X-Men from the past, future, and present, all smushed together, really celebrating the entire legacy of the X-Men franchise.
But leaving enough questions open for whatever happens next when Marvel kills all the X-Men and jettisons them into a whole other publishing line and sells them to DC, and then DC cancels them, and all that stuff that I get hit with on Tumblr every day. I love the X-Men, and everyone I know and everyone I work with loves the X-Men. So don't come at us with why do you hate the X-Men. It's not at all true. It's not true.
Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by a plethora of different artists, the first issue of All New X-Men was published by Marvel Comics in November of 2012, with its two series culminating in Uncanny X-Men issue 600, which was released in November of 2015. And the mutant world is in crisis. With Xavier gone and teams divided, Cyclops will join up with old enemies to start a revolution, but when it's not given easily, how far is he willing to go? And can his former allies do anything to stop him? Look, here's the thing. I was well aware before reading the very first issue of All New X-Men what the reputation of this run is. Or more so, the lack of one altogether. Sure, you dig deep enough into the forums and you're gonna find hate being thrown at it, but normally Bendis' X-Men is just met with, oh yeah, that run. I think I read it. But this is Bendis, the guy behind Ultimate Spider-Man, The New Avengers, one of my favourite Daredevil runs, and countless other titles. So I had no concerns going into this, and thought it was going to be yet another case of X-Men fans hating the X-Men. So imagine my relief when I dove into this and was greeted with balls to the wall action, whilst also setting up where this intriguing team of Cyclops and Magneto are at, and also breaking Emma Frost out of prison at the same time. Yeah. This definitely hit the spot for me. And just look at that cover with how exciting and dynamic it... Wait. This is issue 3? Why is this not the first issue? What better way could there have been to introduce this run? Let's give some context for those who may not know. This run takes place in the wake of Avengers vs X-Men, with Scott Summers being a wanted fugitive after possessing the Phoenix Force in the pursuit of preventing the extinction of mutants. His previous teammates can't look past that he murdered Xavier whilst possessed, which led to him starting his own revolution. So I have to give it credit for being able to make a somewhat palpable introduction, despite the baggage it was starting with. But can't lie, these first two issues didn't do much to make me think I made a wise choice deciding to read this. There's a lot going on in this opening, and Bendis does a good enough job of making sure that most of the important corners get a look in. The concept also affords it a lot of goodwill by having the X-Men divided, but with one of the founding members doing nothing but causing problems for his fellow mutants. And that's why I'm glad Bendis opened the book not shying away from such a toxic character. And if you think for a second that I mean Cyclops, then think again, as I am unwavering in my belief that the true villain of this run is Beast. Because if you've somehow managed to avoid the hook of this series, it's that the original 60s X-Men team are brought into the present day after Hank decides, without consulting anyone, that Scott confronting his younger self might be the only thing that can stop him from going too far. And it's a decision that just keeps coming back to cause more problems, which I'm definitely going to be highlighting throughout this review, just in case there are any doubters. But to keep it fair, what worked for this premise early on was the ticking time bomb element that Beast was suffering a further mutation that was killing him. It justified him using the time cube to make such a rash decision, but time travel is one of those functions that has to be really thought out. But it's something that often trips up this run the later it goes on. Like, forgive me if I'm getting the functionality of the modified time cube confused, but if Beast was so concerned about his fellow mutant causing genocide, why not go to the future, see how he does it, and prevent that? Or if you're not against bringing people from the past, just go get Xavier before Scott kills him. You brought Jean to the present, so don't even try to give me that, oh, you can't bring the dead to a time where they don't exist past argument. Or instead of bringing the whole team, why not just bring one member to the present? I just feel like with this one move, Beast should be removed from the smartest mutants list. But as baffling as his choice is, I really like this premise, and it gave a sense of energy and whimsy to the run, whilst also opening the door to countless possibilities. What if this went further and brought in other eras of X-Men? Throw in the Uncanny roster, the Extreme lineup, and spoiler alert, that didn't happen. But for an introductory story premise, bringing the younger team to the modern day helped to offset some of the darker baggage that it was carrying in with it. And part of that baggage that was difficult for me to get on board with is Magneto being second in command to Cyclops. Now, I'm a casual X-Men fan, I'm not afraid to admit that, because it's probably the reason why I enjoy some of the stories. So sure, there's probably been times in the past where this dynamic has happened, but from the start, it felt like they weren't even on the same page, despite having a common goal. Early on, it was just Eric following Scott's command. I haven't even got a problem with Cyclops as a leader, especially following the X-Men 97 hype train that I'm on, and I loved him during Astonishing, but Magneto should always be the one steering the ship that he's on, or bare minimum be the co-captain that's actually doing the majority of the work. There was the excuse that because his powers weren't up to scratch that he took a step back, but Magneto's someone who goes beyond his moniker of the Master of Magnetism. He has his vision and is ruthless in his pursuit of it, so it was disappointing to see one of my favourite characters from the mutant universe be on the back foot from the beginning. Like, even if he never had any powers, Magneto shouldn't be taking orders from someone who does a scorpion when they're hit. But we've caught up with ourselves now, because the third issue is where this series really started to show its potential. It had a fun idea, sure, but how well that works when it's put into motion is what really mattered. And that's why I think this series should have put this issue first, and then flash back to what we saw in the first two. You'd open with Scott declaring that the abandoned Weapon X site will be the new Xavier school, then go into a big action scene whilst he and Magneto break out Emma. You'd get really engaging and important discussions between the three of them that contextualize the direction that they want to go in, then go into their arrival at the protest so we can see them start their mission of change, and end it on the phenomenal cliffhanger of the 60s team confronting Cyclops. That would have been a great first issue. And yeah, I said it could go back after that, but then it would possibly ruin one of the most unintentionally funny moments in the whole series. When facing his younger self, there are 2 whole pages of Scott theorizing how this could be real. And like, his third thought is that Xavier isn't dead? Bro, he literally died at your feet. If this had been his first or last idea, then maybe I could chalk it up to being some kind of guilt complex. But he thought this was more likely than it being some form of shapeshifter. That's some severe copium. But yeah, had the issue order been different, then we could have gone back and followed the mystery of how Scott's younger team is stood in front of him. Hank being the one to go back would have made more sense, since we'd already seen the wheels in motion for Scott and his potentially dangerous revolution. But trust me, this won't be the only time that the ordering of issues causes, well, issues. Yet the chronology can't completely erase the good and promise that was here from the get-go. Say what you want about Bendis, but I first gravitated towards these books because of his character work, and that still shines through here, especially with the younger team, which I thought would just be a gimmick. But it's clear Bendis wanted to explore this bygone era, and it gave us a fantastic scene where Jean had to control her new powers. And a few issues later, there was a phenomenal page of Jean getting caught up on what the future has in store for her. Pages like that is where Stuart Immonen's art really got a chance to shine, you know, when it isn't being bombarded by dialogue boxes. The double page spread was used sparingly, but here, the layout of the panels was done in such a way that it's clear to understand what is happening with each one, but you can still feel how overwhelming it must be for Jean to make sense of that coming in all at once. Immonen's a consistent staple on the illustrating, and even though I felt his work was better when he worked on Ultimate Spider-Man, there were some true standout moments here, especially the battle between the two Scotts and the scene where Emma was broken out. You could tell he excelled with the younger team, and I would have been okay with Jean being in her original costume more if it was him that was illustrating it. It's just a shame that he couldn't find a way to draw Cyclops waiting outside of a school in a non-creepy way. That's a tough challenge, I'll admit, but it was the first warning sign I had that Cyclops didn't have much of a plan for this revolution of his. Now, I'm not saying that I'm hoping Scott becomes a dictator, but I was just wanting some more indication of how he would achieve his goal. Even if the plan was tyrannical or didn't make much sense, at least give me some kind of trajectory. And it must have been the same for all the villains in this run, because Beast only had one phase of his plan as well. Hey guys, thank you for joining us. This is my plan on how to prevent Cyclops' revolution. Okay, step 1, bring the original X-Men to the present. Yep, I know, you've probably got a ton of questions, but step 2, we just hope that works. And the most disappointing part about that is that the justification Bendis had for Beast taking such a bold move is resolved way too quickly. I didn't buy that Beast was gonna die anyway, and even if he did, he's in the X-Men, so he'll be back. But this was the opening arc, and already throwing in a contrived death scare just to get it off the ground doesn't give me a lot of hope for the rest of the run. But I had to remind myself, this is Bendis. The first arc of Ultimate Spider-Man was a slow burn, and that was for a story where we already knew most of the beats, but that's still one of my favourite comic series of all time, and there were still positives I wanted focus on. It may have been contrived, but I was all in for a longer story about Kitty Pryde training the original team of X-Men in the present day. They were given agency real quick as well, and even though I don't think the decision should have been left to the kids, them voting on whether or not to stay and not all being in agreement with one another was sowing those seeds that I could feel would only escalate the longer the story went on. My biggest gripe with Silver Age comics is how black and white they can often be. It took a while to get out of that phase of someone just being good or evil, and I loved how straight away they were being treated with respect and weren't just being used like props that you could point at and go, isn't this wacky? You know, kind of like what the MCU's now doing with its actors. But they were being used as real characters that were arguably more three-dimensional here than they were in the 60s. I know, that's pretty much blasphemy. You can't say that a comic from the 60s hasn't aged that well. But one way that I feel like Bendis could have got a few quick laughs in was if the younger team's dialogue was the same way it was written during the Stan Lee era. Have the hokiness, the over-explaining, maybe even the constant narration. Because they were brought to the modern day and immediately spoke like they'd always lived there, which just doesn't sit right with me. But still, it allowed them to become deeper characters quicker. Look at issue 6 for example. This was a big favourite for me early on, and it was largely just Cyclops and Angel figuring out who they become in the present day. Especially Scott, as he has to deal with the judgment of others based on actions that he hasn't committed, and Bendis demonstrated this in a really engaging way. I somehow felt bad for the kid while still not trusting his older version. Every shop he goes into, he's recognised, people judge him before he can explain, and I just wondered to myself, why would Beast subject a teenager to this? What's best is that Wolverine's buying none of this, and does not even consider that this is a Scott that hasn't even met Logan yet. Admittedly, he felt a bit one foot in the door, one foot out, and I appreciate that was likely due to him having his own series with Wolverine and the X-Men, and knowing Marvel probably at least 4 other series at the same time. His reaction to Scott being on campus in issue 2 was hilarious, and his input in the decision on if the time traveler should stay or leave was motivated purely for the wrong reasons, but I agreed with him. And the scene of Scott stealing his bike, and we just see Logan's nose twitch, I knew I was in for a good issue. And for as much as it may be the concept of every Freaky Friday-esque story, I got a kick out of seeing the roles being reversed. We really get a scene of Logan dragging Scott back in to keep him in line for sneaking out of the manor, which only got better because they fought. And it was one of those moments where it was clearly about everything else that was going on besides that moment. You could just feel Logan wanting to take his rage towards his Scott out on this younger version, even if it wasn't justified. And Scott just wanted to unleash his frustration out at this world, and the fact that he's facing so much criticism for stuff that he hasn't even done. It gave me hope that the Bendis I remembered from earlier on in his career could still be here, and I really enjoyed the scenes with Kitty helping Jean to understand and control her telepathy. So if there's one thing evident that Bendis hasn't forgotten, it's how to write Kitty Pryde. Sure, previously it was the ultimate version of her, but she's still sassy and full of quips, but now she's gone from the rebellious teen calling Xavier a jerk to guiding one of his favourite students. Whilst Jean herself is in a similar boat to Scott, and coming to terms with what lies in a troubled future with the Phoenix Force. I have to admit, it felt like there was way too much going on for this series, and stuff like the present day Scott really fell by the wayside up until now, but what Bendis did put the spotlight on felt like it had real weight, and was probably the best way to handle this concept. And from these first couple of issues, despite feeling rushed in places, it still delivered, and wasn't anywhere near as bad as a public perception would have you think. Mystique comes into this story quite early on, and I can't speak for her inclusion as a whole at this stage, but her coming to young Scott's help and giving some words of wisdom, even though I didn't trust her, felt like a different angle that I enjoyed seeing unfold. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was too much going on. So when Uncanny relaunched and put the focus back on Scott and his revolution, I was pleased, but I couldn't stop wondering why Marvel didn't just do this from the beginning. All of it was handled in such a haphazard way since we'd already followed part of Scott's story in the all-new series. It's like when you're at work and your team gets split in two, but they don't really know how to divide up the work yet, and there's a lot of standing around. But straight out of the gate, it can be jarring when jumping between the two series, so I'm not really sure of the reading order, but that's something that I'll touch on later. And for as much as I raved about Imminent, Chris Bocolo is just one of those artists that is so hit and miss for me. Don't get me wrong, he's an absolute workhorse, and I have no idea how he does the art for so many books at once. And when he is firing on all cylinders, he is up there with some of the best. Like, look at the Sentinel attack scene that he did to kick off this series. It was dynamic, made great use of the space, and had quite a muted palette that gave this series a more grounded tone. Yet then there are all these anomalies going on, like how eyebrows or even eyes would often be visible over a fringe that's supposed to be covering them. The background looked like it was a JPEG that had been blown out and pixelated, although sometimes you don't even get a full page out of him, like look at this. Normally I edit that kind of thing out of these videos, but I'm gonna leave it in for this one just so you can see how often it happens. And I might get cancelled for this one, but how do you turn Emma Frost from pin-up girl of every teenage boy's dreams to a skinny deodorant can that looks like they can bench 4 plates? She's effectively third in command for this team, but she's so unimpressive in this first issue that I actually had to go back and check that she was there. But what is undeniable was how good the hook at the end of issue 1 was. This was BKV level. We opened on Maria Hill in the SHIELD helicarrier, talking to a prisoner who's offering her information on Cyclops. And on the final page, we learn that the man in the chair is Magneto. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I spoke to myself when I read that page, but if I did, I'd have said something like, this one may fall off the wagon by the end of it, but either way, I'm here for it. Now, for anybody who's tried to read all of Bendis' run after it's finished, you'll notice there's one big hurdle. There's no clear-cut reading order. Some brave souls have tried to plot it out in the most chronologically sensible way, others say to just read one story arc and then go to the next, but I thought the best way to go about it would be release order. And the reason why I mention this here is because regardless of which of those 3 options I'd chosen, there would still be issues with the synergy between the 2 books. And it made scripting this review with any kind of flow a monumental challenge for an idiot like me. Then you throw in 2 versions of the same characters, and I think I'm gonna need to lie down. So from this point on, to make it easier, the 60s version of a character I'm gonna be calling by the human name. And for the modern day, I'm gonna use a superhero alias. So young Scott is just gonna be Scott, with the older version being Cyclops. Bobby will be the younger version, whereas Iceman will be the older. And 60s Hank is just Hank, whereas the older evil version is gonna be Beast. And even while saying all that, I know I'm probably still gonna confuse myself. But the reason why I was comfortable jumping through all these hoops and making rules was because I was excited for the premise that Bendis had presented. I could very much envision myself enjoying the wacky time-travelling shenanigans of All New, then dipping into the more serious Uncanny series. I was hopeful that it wasn't going to be like the second half of Hickman's Fantastic Four, where it tried to find any way to skip the FF issues. But for some reason, that tone that I was hoping for wasn't present in Uncanny. There were scenes where it crept in a bit, mostly centered around the relationships, yet somehow these didn't have the weight that I expected. Prime example, issue 2 of Uncanny gives us what felt like an overdue conversation between Cyclops and Emma. You do have that uncomfortable romantic tension there given their history. I also kinda wanted to see them hit the gym together since I'm certain that this version of Emma could outbench Cyclops, but that tension was only there because I knew about their past as a couple, and not because of anything that Bendis did. Sure, I liked how Bendis didn't force them to get back together because that would have felt too contrived, but it's as if he thought that one conversation would quell any tension and they could go back to being normal. So what could have been one of the most important scenes early on somehow managed to find a way to feel like filler, because despite now having his own series, Cyclops still didn't feel like the focus of Uncanny. And it's a shame too, given this odd position that he's in, where he is the leader of a new team that's seen as the enemy to his family. When else would we get the chance to see that again for a sustained period of a few years? But if nothing else, they really gave him a badass new look. Cyclops has always been one of my favourite X-Men designs. It's so sleek and doesn't need to use many colours, but something about the red suit with the X on the mask just really does it for me. I get the feeling I'm going to be in the minority with that one, mostly because X-Men fans hate any kind of change. But this look is definitely his best fit for his villain era. He needed something different, and I can't put my finger on what exactly it was, but it reminded me of the red hero from Go-Go Loser Ranger. You know what, calling it a villain era doesn't even feel like the right term, because Bendis did manage to find a way to make it so that I couldn't always agree with everything Cyclops does, but I can sort of understand it. Is it a good long-term move for Cyclops in the regular Marvel universe? No. And reading this now, knowing that it doesn't last forever, I can appreciate that Marvel allowed time with this idea. And you know what? Seeing him go from the Xavier Boy Scout to the guy who finally snapped and joined up with Magneto is a far more fascinating idea than another story of the X-Men against the Brotherhood of Mutants. And you know what? At least Cyclops in the villain role lasted for a few issues, which the same can't be said for the whole Magneto as a double agent plot. Like, was I too loud when I said I was looking forward to that? I won't sit here and pretend that I fully bought into Eric's deception, but if there was one character here that could pull off that angle, Well, it would probably be Emma, but she's betrayed Scott far too many times already. Was I asking too much to just have a few issues of Magneto bouncing between Cyclops and Hill? I just remembered that my mum legit used to think that Cyclops Hill was what Cypress Hill was really called, because the tension of this storyline immediately left in the next scene that we had with Eric, because he revealed everything. So for me, the book is already on strike too when it comes to Magneto. Okay, but I do really like the pearlescent suit, so maybe knock off half a strike. I also like to imagine that this suit was just a happy accident because it doesn't look like a colour scheme that would work for Magneto. But I honestly think that Bendis never had an intention of following through with Magneto as a double agent, because if he hadn't revealed it immediately to Cyclops, he'll terminate the deal the next time that she speaks to Eric. Did Bendis really need a contingency in case Magneto's own reveal hadn't killed the hype enough? Like, at least give it some time, Maria. This was more short-lived than the girlfriends you can get on GTA San Andreas.
I need something a bit better than this shit.
The reason why I'm banging on about this so much is because I think Bendis' time on the X-Men is in this weird dilemma, because yeah, this needed 2 series, and was probably being pushed by Marvel to have a second title. In a similar vein to how Fantastic Four and Avengers were having 2 series that were being written concurrently by the same writer, but that was still never the intention when Bendis started on the book. So when Uncanny did kick off, it needed a hook to grab people in, give them a reason to pick up the series even if they were reading all new, but the actual objective of the series hadn't yet been established. And when I compare the 2 series, that feels possible because All New has so much energy despite arguably having a weaker premise. The story tries to justify that Magneto went undercover following the Sentinel attack, as he wanted to use the government intel to see who was behind it, but I don't think that was the original plan, as in the same conversation, Eric admits he doesn't even believe what they told him, and Maria then broke the connection anyway. So what was to gain? He knew as much before contacting Maria as he did after. It's just a shame because this is the only real story Magneto has in the opening arc, and I really wanted more. Give me a power struggle between him and Cyclops. Have Eric take him under his wing and teach him a more violent type of leadership. Show us what he relies on when he can't fall back on his powers. Magneto is one of the greatest characters in all of Marvel, all of comics even, and the dynamic of he and Cyclops not fully trusting each other, but knowing that they need to work together to further their own agenda could have been the linchpin of this whole series. I think that had potential, as the few scenes we did get with Cyclops and Magneto was some of the most memorable in the Uncanny book, and even a poor version of that would have been infinitely more entertaining than following the storyline of these new students. I'll bring them up throughout the video, but for a large part of this run, I just knew them as the students and Golden Balls. Do you want to know why I remember him? Because the only reason he exists in this book is so that he can shout Golden Balls. That's it. Did you find it funny just then when I said Golden Balls? No? Well, fortunately for you, I won't do it anywhere near as much as this series does for cheap comedic relief. But again, Magneto managed to make the students more tolerable in the few scenes that he had with them, and seemed to want to be a mentor more than Cyclops did. And another great thing from Eric's whole subplot was that it set up the early confrontation with the Avengers. Although, let's be honest, that concept has never needed much of an excuse. That's not a knock at Avengers vs X-Men, I've got a huge soft spot for that event, probably more so since I reviewed it. But unfortunately, this confrontation left me wanting more. The build up to it was great. Pretty much the whole issue was this heated conversation, and you could see each side devising a plan in secret whilst trying not to escalate anything. All of that, great. But then when something was finally about to happen, the time freezer mutant got them out of there. Again, similar to the Magneto working with S.H.I.E.L.D. thread, it felt like it was there to grab, but didn't have the intention of delivering. What I did like though is how this contrasted with the confrontation that the Avengers had in the all-new series, and I got the benefit of the 2 series running concurrently. Bendis even got a big chuckle out of me here. We see the scene of Cap talking to Beast, so at least it's clear that he went direct to the villains in both series, but we don't get to hear the dialogue. Instead, we get Kitty and Iceman narrating what they imagined was being said, and then the original conversation ran on without a hitch. Moments like that gave me hope that the old Bendis was still there, and also varied it up from just another conversation between the Avengers and an X-Men team. Overall, I found that the all-new series was the more enjoyable of the 2, and I think it's largely because I didn't have that expectation. I'd fully expected the younger team to have left by now, but them remaining in the present felt like a dynamic that paid off more than anything with Cyclops. And what I think made that happen was that All New focused on students that I already had a vested interest in, and expanded on that. Don't get me wrong, I understand that the X-Men will always have the school element, but the characters introduced in Uncanny didn't do a lot to get me to care about them, nor was there enough teaching going on so that I could have interesting scenes with the characters there that I did care about. True, there is the advantage that I already like characters like Jean, Scott, and a pre-villain era Hank, but Bendis didn't didn't just rest on those laurels, and used this series as a way to further their stories in a way that Silver Age comics sometimes avoided. There is this grey area, a Jean grey area, maybe a better name for it. Sorry. Because there was a magnificently unsettling scene with it. It was after the original team had taken a vote on whether to stay in the present or return to the past, and Warren, having spoken previously with the older Angel and certain that he wanted to go back, was outnumbered by his fellow X-Men. This alone caused a lot of great tension whilst making Warren one of the most interesting characters, and gave us a great action scene with the past and present Angels taking on an army of Hydra agents. But Warren realises that he's a bit out of his depth, that technology and the enemy have developed massively since the time that he was from. It forces him to try and send himself back, and I enjoyed him having his own agency and not always being a follower. He was hysterical, which is something you don't expect from Warren, but even more so that in the very next page, he isn't. His demeanour changes. He's happy, carefree, wondering what's for dinner, and then in walks Jean. I love this scene. With this one moment, it convinced me that the younger team staying had potential. Jean had only just discovered her telepathy and was already using it to manipulate the minds of her team and had such a cold rationale with it. I honestly thought this was setting up Jean to become the villain of the series. Maybe even prompt the Phoenix Force on its own or something. Scott was also fun to follow. It's like he was trapped between a rock and a hard place, that he still has to act as leader for his team, a role that he was still only just getting to grips with, but now has this doubt behind everything that he does because of the man that he knows he can end up becoming. I do wish there had been more with him over the guilt that he felt over knowing that he'll go on to kill Xavier, because that feels like it should have been a bigger moment. But in all honesty, we don't get much of that from the Cyclops who did kill him, so maybe it's just a character flaw. But those interactions between different character eras is what made a lot of these early issues interesting. It is a cheap trick to get easy enjoyment, but if it works, it works. For example, Warren got a really good scene where he confronts Beast. Because shock horror, everyone's found out that he's not dying anymore, which is great for 3 reasons. Firstly, I don't want to wish death on an X-Man, especially since it would mean a separate spin-off event and then a year-long wait until they're resurrected. Secondly, it emphasises my earlier point, that Bendis was just using this as a cheap catalyst to justify bringing the younger members to the present. And finally, Beast doesn't even acknowledge it when one of the members of the X-Men who wanted to go back to his time brings it up. If that doesn't count as a villain move, then I don't want to know what does. Beast also says that he doesn't want to get involved now, which is hilarious considering that the whole mess is his fault. And whether it was intentional or not, Warren brings up a great point for this entire series. Where's the genocide? Not in the sense of show it to me because I really want to see it, but if it doesn't seem like an imminent threat, then what do the original X-Men intend to do now? They confronted Cyclops already, which only seemed to make him get a badass new suit, so what's the plan now? For as much as their dynamic within this world was the best part of this run, I can't avoid the fact that there's no in-universe logic to them staying anymore, especially considering how damaging it could be to the space-time continuum. There's even multiple examples throughout where I was almost screaming at the page to just send them back before it's too late. Although a white guy shouting at a marginalised community to go back to where they came from is a line that I don't really want to cross. But it was just a bit disappointing that it was so early on that run-defining problems were cropping up. In particular, the synergy between the two series. There were times where this worked really well, but then others when it would completely ruin the other title, making you question if it was even the same guy that was writing both. There's a great cliffhanger in All New when Cyclops, Magneto, and his team come to the Jean Grey School to persuade their students to join them. There's undeniable tension, the Lawn attacks Cyclops, and the friction between him and Wolverine is palpable. The Stepford sisters get persuaded to join. Cyclops asks his younger self the most responsible question of why he's still there. Young Scott says it's to accomplish the mission and doesn't elaborate on what that mission is, and then on the last page to have us frothing at the mouth for the next issue, someone we can't see announces that they'll join. I had every suspicion it was going to be Warren, but I'm reading this in release orders, so I had to wait until after the next Uncanny issue, and this one's also taking place during that confrontation, which makes sense. If Cyclops and his team are there, then it's going to be important for their storyline. To break it up a bit, we get a telekinetic conversation between Emmett and the Stepford sisters, and I still don't have a clue who they are. But that's not where the problem overlapping with All New is. It's the fact it completely ruins the reveal of Warren switching sides. It was hardly the best kept secret on the planet, but there are 2 full issues of Warren having switched sides before we even get back to the series where we see him switch. We don't even see him joining Uncanny, he just shows up at the Weapon X site in the next scene. Like, were you expecting me to not notice? The guy's got huge angel wings. Worse so, that entire issue of All New that came out a full month month after Angel was already showing up in the Uncanny series, features what could have been one of the best, most emotionally charged scenes in the entire series, where his fellow X-Men were trying everything to stop him leaving. There was so much going on here. I once again thought this would be the catalyst to cause them to all go back. Beast once again just stands there and watches the chaos he's arranged all unfold like a true evil mastermind. But it's all for nothing, as Warren leaves with Cyclops, which I'd already had confirmed was going to happen. So let me just get this straight, there's no official announced reading order for Bendis' X-Men, but if I read this in release order, then the chronology doesn't line up. And if I did just read these as the individual series, then one of the main characters leaves and I wouldn't know what's happening with them. And I'm not blaming Bendis for the release schedule, as that's a point of controversy at the end of the run as well. We may seem crazy, but it's as if Marvel were setting it up to fail. No, surely there's no validity to that conspiracy, so let's not pay any attention. If anything, this probably should have been where the divide between the two series began, if it wasn't going to do it from issue 1. It would have made more sense here with the reader having the choice on whether or not to follow both teams, rather than feeling compelled or confused due to the situation with Warren. Although in saying that, once he switches, he becomes as impactful as the other new students anyway. It's a difficult balance as well, because once that synergy was broken, I ended up second guessing everything. Prime example, a few issues later, we open with a scene of Jean unleashing the Phoenix Force. Did I skip an issue or something? Is Uncanny going to pick this up later and the release dates have tripped them up again? Was this a crossover with another X series? Oh wait, no, it's just a flash forward but with no indication. And because I still remembered what happened with the Angel debacle, I assumed I'd missed something between issues and spent 10 minutes googling this series and spoiled half of it for myself. All because Bendis had me doubting things so much that I didn't even give it the benefit of the doubt and read the next page. But I can't say that jumping between the two series didn't have at least one advantage, because it helped break up a lot of the repetitive aspects. Especially early on, the trope of the younger team pointing at stuff and saying, "Whoa, this is in the future," would have been far more grating if I didn't have the Uncanny series to give me a bit of time away from that. Additionally, Uncanny going down a more mystical route was definitely a choice, and one that really set itself apart from all new. I'm not too sure how I feel about this being the first major independent hurdle for Cyclops' team to overcome, especially when there's such a wealth of great villains within the X-Men universe that we could have seen them go up against. I liked it from the angle that it was bringing magic into the fold more, because prior to this, her only role seemed to be the teleporter. But this Dormammu storyline pushed her to the forefront at the expense of pretty much a whole team. I still didn't really care much for any of these new students, but Goldballs is panicking whilst they're in the limbo dimension and decides he wants to leave the team, but why would I care if he leaves? He's been a punchline up until this point. One thing I did love was Magneto carrying nails in his utility belt. Actually, that might be my favourite thing so far in this run. Am I gonna sound dumb right now for loving this? As he always carried these in a little pouch. What's in the other pouches? This little moment at least showed that Bendis can still inject that sense of humour that I knew him for, whilst it still made in-universe sense because of Magneto's power struggle. But what didn't need to be injected at all was the big reveal of Dazzler. I'm so glad this hadn't been built up for too long, because my god, what a wet fart of a reveal. Again, my X-Men knowledge is limited, but when it was teased that Maria was recruiting a new mutant, I was hoping for Captain Britain, Colossus, Gambit, Rogue, or even someone who's already in the book. What if it had been the older Angel? How much fun could it have been if Warren got betrayed by his older self? And look, I care about retention on these long ass videos, so normally I wouldn't say everything that I wanted to here, but she does not have a massive role in the grand scheme of things, which annoyed me even more when I was scripting this part of the video and seeing how early on she was introduced. I'm all for giving a lesser known, maybe even a bit of a joke character a chance at redemption, but that wasn't this. It's just a real good job that Maria Hill announced who she was, because I don't know what was going on with Fraser Irving's art. Well, he made her look like some kind of sexy feral ghoul. How much do you want to bet that's already a Rule 34 category? His style worked really well when dealing with the limbo dimension and other abstract elements, but something about the way he illustrated human faces looked a little too uncanny in parts. At least I guess it was in the right place. I can't even say if I liked or disliked his work because it was such a mismatch in places, and overall felt as if it was a collage made from other creators. But he can draw a beautiful Dormammu, I have to give him that. Yet the second I heard his name, I said to myself, they best not drag Doctor Strange into this. Leave the man alone. He's been out there saving the day in every Marvel run I've been reading lately. Just let the Doc have a nap. You've got dimension traveling mutants. Let Steven have a nap. But yeah, this is awkward. So Doctor Strange is in this, and I don't mind his inclusion one bit. It's like I've always said, Wake that doc up, he doesn't need to sleep. What I liked here is that they use this as a way to take the armor off Magic and make her a far more likable character. She has vulnerabilities and fears, but at the same time she's entrusted with being tough and leading the next generation. Her cold, stoic demeanor was becoming a bit stale by this point, so it was a good time to delve deeper, as I wasn't too familiar with her character. I also liked how she was going to Strange in the past, even if it did make me wonder why she couldn't just kidnap the younger X-Men, wipe the memories, and send them back to their time. Honestly though, the rest of this first chunk of Uncanny is one of those that just keeps taking over. Nothing too amazing nor anything too awful. In saying that, there was one huge standout moment between Cyclops and Magneto that was delivering on everything that I wanted between these two. It was just a shame that it was so short that it was over before it began, and there wouldn't have been much to enjoy if Bendis didn't cram each panel with so much dialogue. Mostly this time's just being used to give us a storyline revolving around Golden Balls, but it did go some way to help flesh out his character. The X-Men team that's apparently way more villainous than the one where Beast coerces children to leave the home and then won't take them back, immediately allow Fabio to return home. That's the basics of the plot, but this is where the main involvement of Dazzler comes into play. For as much as a character didn't impact the overall storyline, when she is confronted by Cyclops' team, I like the tension between them. There's that obvious sense of you're either with us or against us, and I wish that could have played out more. Like, how would Cyclops have felt towards Mystique's plan? Would there have been resentment towards Warren? You see, those type of questions could have given us great stories. But what this plot revolving around Golden Balls did was finally make this group feel like a team. It was badass seeing Cyclops' crew just go right into the helicarrier and save him, especially after Fabio had been somewhat abandoned by his real family. It gave Cyclops a chance to solidify himself once again as a confident leader, and just the fluidity between the team was nice, with Magic teleporting Maria away after Cyclops finishes a one-liner, and it was around here when Uncanny focused more on world building. Even's art really helped in this part too, as Cyclops and the gang appear at a pro-mutant rally, and I appreciated Bendis taking that time to show us that the whole world isn't against Cyclops, but the almost muddy look gave it a harrowing sense of realism that the world is divided. This even carried on as we're introduced to Blockbuster Sentinel, in what was a great fight that really zeroed in on Cyclops, while still giving other members of the team moments to shine. It touched on how much weaker their powers had gotten in the wake of AVX, and I quite enjoyed the mystery of who was behind the attack. Little did I know how long it would take for this to get picked up again, but at least Uncanny was thrown enough at the team they somewhat disguised the bigger questions, which I can't say for all new. Pretty much every issue I read with the younger team, I was left with the thought, so how does this help them prevent Cyclops' revolution? It made Warren the smartest of this younger team because he's the only one who tried to go back. Sure, I liked a lot of the character elements and side stories, but the whole thing felt like a political campaign where change is demanded, but then there's no plan on how to get it. I wouldn't have minded as much if it had taken a leaf out of Uncanny's book and have a storyline that distracted the focus enough, but there were times where it felt like it was going with the wind and had forgotten some of the earlier storylines. The Avengers confront the X-Men again, but this time it's the Uncanny Avengers roster, so I guess I'm supposed to act like I didn't see something similar a few issues earlier. For those who may not be aware, the Uncanny Avengers was a team that started after AVX and had members from both the Avengers and the X-Men, one of which was Havoc, Alex Summers, which gave us a really sweet moment between him and his younger, older brother that didn't overstay its welcome. You could feel the history that was there and yet hadn't been spoken, and some of the relief Alex must have felt by remembering who his brother used to be. Honestly, I preferred this Avengers confrontation more than the first, and think it would have hit harder had that not been in the run. We already had that one against Cyclops' team, so that scratched enough of that itch, whereas this had a different tone to it. The reason the Avengers are there is because Mystique has assembled a team of evil mutants, as she makes moves to take over Madripoor, but her last attack was under the guise of the younger X-Men, leading the Earth's mightiest heroes to their doorstep. What was great about this interaction was how much it was like a mini version of the Thing, with everyone questioning if Mystique was already amongst them. That's the kind of presence Mystique should be having, and had they made her a more dominant threat earlier on, it probably could have been pulled off well, rather than the way she goes on to be used. It's just that prior to this, there had been so much chaos with the school and two separate teams, they didn't make Mystique feel like a major threat. I even really enjoyed Jean feeling the consequences of her telepathy. She was poking about in Wanda's mind and had to learn all about House of M, which solidified how that was one of the only noughties Marvel events that had a real lasting impact. And Jean even asked the most important question: how can Wanda be allowed in the Avengers? Yeah, Wanda can say she wasn't conscious, but am I just misremembering House of M? It has been a few years since I reviewed it, but I fully remember her being awake and aware when she said no more mutants. mutants? Or is it just that her powers are so OP that she's automatically forgiven and allowed to join? And that's exactly why this interaction between the Avengers and the all-new worked better than the first, because it wasn't just Cap telling them to keep everything in line. The all-new team had more confidence, more knowledge of this era, and could point out that them being out of time still isn't the worst thing that can happen to mutants. And when there were these confrontations, Bendis did a good job of making both sides have a reasonable case. It never felt like you were forced to agree with whoever was the title character, and if anything, it showed the importance of perspective, because we also get an overlap between all new and Uncanny Avengers after Alex does an interview. That whole thing does take place in their series, which admittedly I haven't been reading alongside the Bendis books, but Alex publicly denounces the word mutant, which prompts an empowered speech from Kitty that perfectly illustrated why she can't agree with him. With just a snippet to go off, I was on her side, but in a bit of an immersion killer, the whole page from that issue is included at the end, and I could understand what Alex was trying to say. It did feel like the line was taken out of context, and people were just adding their own emotions to it, and I'm just glad this is set in a fictional world, and that type of thing doesn't happen in real life. And for as much as it may stray into that gimmicky zone, a large part of what worked was when the younger team got to bounce off of the more established characters. We touched on it in part 1, but it was fun to see it evolve, and Scott still saw himself as the leader of his team, still throwing out orders even whilst Kitty was there. It highlighted why we still need to believe, and hope for redemption with Cyclops, because he used to be the strong leader that made him such an interesting character, and we get that here as Scott is able to come up with ideas that even Wolverine and Kitty couldn't. In saying that though, are you honestly expecting me to believe that no one had a better plan than the one where Wolverine and the all-new team immediately fly to the location where Mystique framed them, and the backup plan if they were spotted was just to immediately flee? What was plan C gonna be? Were you gonna expect Beast to bail you out if they got arrested? Well, can't lie, there were a great chunk of issues here, even if logic was thrown out the window to get there. For as much as the build up to Mystique had left me wanting, her team's confrontation with the all-new group felt like the first major villain that this team had gone up against, with them doing such a good job that they even get the approval of Cap, and there were splashes of teenage rebellion when they threw themselves into the battle, despite being ordered not to, and Wolverine got a huge moment where he was like, nah, not chancing this again, and launched himself towards Phoenix. And the emergence of the Phoenix Force within Jean had me wondering if this was going to be the point of the run. If Beast's time travel prompted this, what would that mean when they do return, or for the continuity? Would Dark Phoenix happen earlier, or could they avoid it altogether? And might that be the thing that sets Cyclops back on the right path? It's just disappointing because a lot of these important questions don't seem to hold much weight, which to me begs the question, why bother toying with time travel if it's not even going to be thought out properly? Like, look at this example from issue 15, where Jean's clearly thinking about a panel that happened in John Cassidy's The Astonishing X-Men, a series that Jean wasn't a part of, from a scene that Kitty wasn't involved in, so there's no way that she could have pulled this out when she read her mind, and from an angle that Wolverine wouldn't have been able to see himself from, so how on earth would she ever have known what this looked like? And it may be minor, but I'm just glad that it's the only plot hole that I've found with this whole time travel thing. There's that super pedantic part of my brain again. So you know what, I can forgive such an odd plot hole, especially if it doesn't really factor into the main story, but what I can't forgive is Jean starting a romance with Hank because she reads the mind of present day Beast. Like, is she just permanently reading everyone's mind now? Or did Beast do this on purpose because he started a sentence out loud, but then continued in his head, which just feels like he's trying to lure her in? And as we've seen, him luring in these younger X-Men isn't something he's against. It was just instructions as well, so how did Beast go from the flange needs to go into the neutral axis? But God, what would my life have been if me and Jean had shagged? Probably the word flange, and I'm not sure if I'm looking too much into it, but something doesn't sit right with me considering the age difference between them. Like, I don't know if they could get an arrest warrant, but Beast should definitely be on some kind of list. And not teaching kids. And yeah, I get it, Jean's a teenager, she's confused and impulsive, but her and Hank just don't make a good couple to me. And with it still being early on in the grand scheme of this run, I can't say I was excited to see how this triangle would pan out. It may just be because I'm mostly thinking of the modern day Beast, but Hank isn't open or vulnerable enough to really be there for Jean in the way that Scott is. And I'll admit that Scott's not perfect on that front either. Like, imagine if Dark Phoenix had happened with Hank by his side. I just can't see it having the same emotional pull. Hank has always been the one that's more committed to his goal and the pursuit of science, which is ironic considering the modern day Cyclops in this. But still, if Bendis was desperate to have a love triangle, this doesn't feel like the best choice, nor does it really add much positive to the legacy of this run. Hell, Bobby would have been a better pick. And you probably know how that would have panned out. Yet even in the most baffling of moments, Bendis never forgets to add humour. Because honestly, is there anything more funny than Beast thinking his life would have been better if he'd gone out with Jean? And let's make it clear, this is the modern day villain Beast who's thinking this, not the Hank who doesn't have a clue. The one who's seen a life unfold already. And just think about how well that relationship was for Cyclops. Sure Beast, your life would have been infinitely better if you had a girlfriend who can turn into Phoenix at any given moment, has an evil clone, and dies on a pattern more consistent than the Olympics. You should probably just stick to kidnapping teenagers out of time, but you got me good with that one. Damn, this part ended up being way longer than I intended, but the one thing I can't deny is that the more I read of All New, the more of it I wanted to read. There was a sense of fun and whimsy, but with the sinister undertone that it couldn't last forever. Although the inner relationships of the younger team were being tested, it was wholesome seeing a united X-Men team that we're on the same page. The David Lafuente art injected a sense of youthful optimism, along with a fun story of Scott and Bobby enjoying being a teenager in a different time. So for as much as I may harp on about them not having a plan, it's more forgivable in this team than it is in Uncanny, because they are still finding their feet. But that excuse can only work for so long. And there was a hefty amount of this series still in front of me, and for as much as I've been trying to defend Bendis' run, I had the feeling that my famously thin patience wouldn't last much longer. I've noticed a weird phenomenon that happens in a lot of these longer runs. It's where the writer builds up to a big arc that feels like a culmination of all the storytelling that's been done so far, and was probably the prime opportunity to end the run on a high. It happened with The Wedding in Tom King's Batman, God of Hammers in Donny Cates' Thor, Devil's Reign in Zdarsky's Daredevil, and Battle of the Atom would also fall into this bracket. And for as much as some may hope that this is leading into a relentless bashing of this storyline, I felt it came at the right time. Sure, I like the original X-Men team in the present day, and who knows what would have drove this series without it, but the concept is so interesting because of the ticking time bomb element. But that only works if the bomb is capable of exploding. Until now, there was no sense of repercussion for something that very clearly has a damning impact on the space-time continuum. It was moving forward as if the all-new team didn't need to go back, and could just live out their remaining days in the present, which almost defeats the point of bringing them to the present anyway. Were there just permanently going to be doubles of Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, and Angel running about? Will there now be a 60s era of Marvel without the X-Men if they don't go back? But it felt like Bendis hadn't cared much about these questions, so I was just pleased that Battle of the Atom gave this storyline weight by dragging in every X-Men title around this one conundrum. And for once, this had a structured reading order, which my OCD brain loved. I could have questioned why this wasn't a thing before or after. That is something that I definitely could be questioning. I'm just going to enjoy it when it does happen. Right out of the gate, this event had a sense that it was a turning point for the series, especially with Magic giving us a look at what I assume was some kind of dystopian future. Was this a result of the younger team staying? Is this what happens if they leave? It then brings it back and gives us a great action scene with Kitty and the young X-Men battling it out against a Sentinel, along with another really dynamic page of Jean using a telepathy. I know it was Frank Cho here, but rather than the difference in layout being due to the artist, I thought it was because Jean was able to control the power better, and they'd rather show that than tell. Cho's work was great on this, and he's one of those artists that's rarely disappointing, but I did think his Scott was a little too skinny, to the point where he looked like a bobblehead. And it may just be the suit, but he more than makes up for it with how intimidating his Cyclops is. He also draws Emma in a way that doesn't remind me of teenage me. I also liked how this opening issue made an effort to realign Cyclops so that he didn't just come across as a straight up villain. Him teleporting in with his crew to help the younger team when they needed it, even though they turned down his offer before, showed that he is at least true to his morals of helping the next generation. Or even, maybe, the earlier generation. And we didn't see Beast there, did we? It highlighted that the two factions aren't so much in a civil war, but just that there's been too much water under the bridge between Cyclops and the X-Men. But that doesn't stop him from looking out for his fellow mutants. And it was nice getting a scene of the two teams fighting alongside each other. But honestly, what happens at the beginning of Battle of the Atom breaks this run beyond repair. In the heat of the battle, Scott is hit by one of the Sentinels. His heart stops, and by all accounts he's dead, until the healer uses his plot-saving power, which may be the record for the quickest X-Men resurrection of all time. But amidst the chaos, Cyclops disappears. Up until now the rules were murky, but this here confirms that Back to the Future logic applies, and anything that happens to the younger mutants will impact their older counterparts. Don't get me wrong, it's great to have that answer, but it's the worst one that Bendis could have chosen, as it sets a precedent. The students must go back. If one of the original 5 dies, that's it. If Beast created something previously in his history, that now shouldn't exist. If Jean doesn't return, then the Dark Phoenix saga will never happen, which might work out better for some of the characters now I think about it. And I'm not condoning killing a student, but if someone really did want to ensure that Cyclops is stopped, they could just, kill Scott. Look, I'm not saying it's morally right, but it solves the problem. Fortunately, this qualm is the focal point of Battle of the Atom, and gave it a greater sense of stakes, but it adds to my belief that this was supposed to be, and probably should have been, the conclusion. Especially when you factor in that an X-Men group from the future are thrown into the mix, so it's kinda like a Christmas Carol for mutants. But beyond Xavier, Deadpool, and the new Cerebro, I didn't care much for them. There wasn't anything exciting about them, beyond being from the future. Even their Luke felt like a generic, we're from a shithole timeline, design. They teleport themselves to the present day because things in the future continue to get worse as a result of how long the younger team remained in the present, which seems like they need the time cube to travel rather than having a time traveler in the team, so I'm not too sure how they plan to get the younger team back without everyone's help. So instead, they pretty much immediately start a fight. Something was sketchy about them from the beginning, and I find it baffling how they were given more respect than the 60s X-Men who had been there for a while now and proven themselves. Jean doesn't help her case because if she could telepathically speak with people, why not get a message out to the teachers? And don't tell me the future mutants blocked it, as apparently Jean could hack Wolverine's arms through her telepathy, which Logan also immediately sussed out despite being in the presence of the grandson of Xavier and not knowing a thing about any of these guys. As well, Jean Grey is one of these future mutants, which might be the least surprising thing in X-Men history. It's pretty much a given that if a team of X-Men exists, then Jean has either died in front of them or is still an active member of it. But despite those problems, the stage had been set and I like the premise of it. For the first time in a while, it felt like the run had gotten into gear and had that scope as it folded in the X titles that Bendis wasn't writing, and not in the someone turns on the TV and there's a reference on the news kind of tie-in, but the story was told across them all. Yet despite that, this feels super formulaic, to the point where most of the parts can be summed up in a few words. This one's a chase, this one's on Utopia, this one is a fight, this one's in the future, and for as much as I enjoyed the scope, I wish it hadn't have felt so rigid. With there being a handful of different writers, there could also be some odd things between the different books. I felt Brian Wood was trying too hard to do dialogue like Bendis, and I know some people have issues with how Bendis does conversations, but at least that's his style, and I would have liked a sample here of what Wood's X-Men was like. Or was that another series that I was meant to be reading this whole time? But I'm not too sure if this was an event that was written by committee, or if Bendis was the driving force, because there was a scene in part 4 where it felt like Brian Wood's dialogue continued, and Maria Hill was just doing some odd imitation of Ultimate Peter Parker, and the jokes just do not land. Trust me, I know that humour's subjective, but one issue ends with Emma saying the message boards would love this, and I can't help but think, who's she saying that for? They're on Utopia with about 20 or so other mutants, and I can't imagine that many of them frequent message boards after the near-death battles. And she's saying it to Jean, who's from the 60s, and probably doesn't even know what a message board is. Yet I can't deny, the psychic battle itself was fun. The juxtaposition between the realms with these huge battles happening in the sky, yet the entire time the characters are just stood still, got a huge laugh out of me, even if Cameron Crowley's artwork could look far too flat in this issue. And if I'm honest, all of the battles were entertaining. Probably my favourite was the one in part 9, because Cyclops and Wolverine bury the differences, and it highlighted that the best fights are when there is emotion connected to it. Had more of the moments been centered around the characters I'd been following up until this point, who knows how different it might have been. And it feels like for everything I enjoyed about Battle of the Atom, it's followed with a but. Prime example, I was very pleased to see the relationship between Jean and Scott get some attention, with them running away together being a constant for when times get tough. They're solid, they're meant to be, but Jean did still have that bizarre fling with Hank 3 issues earlier that is still up in the air. The only thing I can surmise is that maybe this whole run is about how messy things have always been, and always will be. I'm not much of a Silver Age fan, but there must have been something that Bendis saw in Hank that warranted such a love triangle. And even the future X-Men proved that things can always get crazier and messy. There was an idea touched on that guided me towards this, where the future X-Men say that the younger team were only allowed to stay so long because it was a coping mechanism for losing Xavier. But as this event shows, bringing what they thought was a less messy era into the present led to things only getting worse, and shedding light on some of those flaws in these teenage versions that may have been glossed over throughout history. Whereas yeah, this current era of the X-Men had some major baffling moments, but the past did as well, and so will the future. And Emma calling out Cyclops' ego was a moment that felt long overdue as well, because it cut to the root of that issue that Cyclops couldn't let go of what was. It's just a shame that there were so many voices chiming in everywhere at this stage that he only got a small amount of the focus. I was really struggling to keep track of who was siding with who anymore, as the established teams were disagreeing a lot also, so I ended up categorizing characters as either being there to fight or waiting around to signpost. And honestly, it helped. Beyond there being a lot of characters, too many of them had to have a moment. And I get it because other stories are getting involved and they can't just pause their story arcs for Battle of the Atom. But was I supposed to feel something when one of these future X-Men is revealed to be Jubilee's son? I didn't even realize Jubilee was still around. When one of the Jean Grey school meets the future version of himself as the Phoenix, was this supposed to affect me in any way? Sure, if I'd been reading Wolverine and the X-Men alongside this, then it might have meant something. But I was struggling to bounce between the two series with no reading order, and you'll want to throw more into the mix for this to make sense? In saying that, I am interested in how Battle of the Atom reads as part of the Aaron Wolverine run, so maybe that's going to have to be a future deep dive. But beyond just problems between the titles, some of the reveals fell flat, and I can't see reading all of these series fixing that. One of the future evil mutants turns out to be a son that Wolverine will eventually have, and my first reaction was that I didn't buy it. My dumbass thought that must have been part of Mystique's previous plan, and the whole team hadn't time travelled and were just the one she'd assembled. And for me, there's nothing worse than when the storyline I think is happening sounds better than the one that we get. But had that been the case, then there wouldn't have been this idea that this was just the next version of the Brotherhood of Mutants. And if the X-Men are to exist, then this battle will continue to wage on. Again, some things will change, but others will stay the same, like Beast always being a villain. The way we learn of this reveal is because certain mutants travel to the future and meet the real X-Men of that era, leading me to ask one huge, steel-bodied question. Why isn't Colossus in this run already? Yeah, that's purely a selfish question from me, but last I remember, he was alive at the end of AVX. Granted, he wanted to kill his sister and was living in a cave, but he was alive. The adventure in the future was quite interesting though, and it did the right thing of leaving me with more questions about that timeline. But it's just a shame that it came quite late into this event, and despite having ample time, the whole thing felt rushed. The premise was great, with all the mutants in the same place and the SHIELD helicarrier firing everything at them, but because of how rushed it was in getting to this moment, I had a suspicion that maybe Bendis or Aaron or whoever wrote that last issue, because the names quoted on the cover don't even match what's on the inside page. I'd watched X-Men First Class the night before scripting this, and realised that scene is so good that they just tried to copy and paste it here. As well, what started with a great premise that could have built to a crescendo for this entire run seemed to lose sight of what it was about. The focus was originally on the younger X-Men, the consequences of them staying in the present, and what it meant for the modern day mutants. But towards the end I found myself asking, where are the original X-Men? Where's Kitty during all of these battles? Why is Colossus dead again? Why doesn't Kitty get to react to a Colossus being here, nor a Colossus dying again? But instead, they want me to give a shit about future Beast being shot, or two Wolverine knockoffs fighting? I won't spoil anything here about what happens beyond Battle of the Atom, and I can't even guarantee that some of these decisions were solely Bendis, but it felt like the objective of this event changed partway through, and it became about setting up the next phase of X-Men stories, rather than a culmination of what they'd been working towards. Battle of the Atom also finds itself in a catch-22 dilemma, because connecting to the wider scope of the X-Men narrative is what it needed to do, but also was part of the problem because it just highlighted things rather than trying to progress them. In the final part, we get a great scene between Wolverine and Cyclops that in the grand scheme of the Schism era is integral, but nothing comes of it because the two Bendis series and Aaron's titles have more issues coming out. The biggest thing pointing towards that problem is the fact that a key scene like that is just an epilogue. It feels tacked on despite the weight it carries. There's nothing wrong with having an epilogue, but I always felt it should either be a tease for something important to come, maybe a sneaky way to promote channel sponsors, or a throwaway scene to wrap up a secondary plot point. It kind of irks me when it's something integral to the entire series and I could have accidentally skipped over it. What did they think this was, the Return of the King but at the halfway point? In my eyes, that only solidified my theory that at some stage Battle of the Atom was going to be the conclusion of this series, or at least that of the young X-Men's time in the present. It was a peak of all the storylines that had been started by Bendis, and even added evidence of why things needed to wrap up. And when that happens at the halfway point of a run, where else can it go without feeling like it's lost its way? Because ironically, Bendis focused more on winning the battle, and it cost him the war. Damn, there's so much to talk about with this run, and it's just a shame that there isn't a convenient way to read it. But if you want to pick up some books that are in print and support the channel at the same time so that these longer videos can carry on, then make sure you check out the channel's sponsors. If you're in the EU, we've got Comics Bugle, and for everyone else, we've got Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order.
Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like.
And Comics Bugle have been a huge support to this channel over the last few years, and they can be to you as well, because if you use code WOOFWOOF, you can get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. So get your orders in. Oh, confused why there's a second epilogue for a middle part? Well, that's still only half as many as Battle of the Atom. And if you're the type to skip an epilogue, or thought it was safe after the second and third didn't do much to excite you, you would have missed out on the huge plot point that Kitty and the younger X-Men team have all jumped ship to join Cyclops. So for anyone who skips this epilogue, this is how it feels, because I'm not going to explain it happened in part 4. If the writers can't give it the proper time, then don't expect me to. How on earth was this left to be the most tacked on of all the tacked on scenes? It fundamentally changes the dynamic of both Bendis books. To chalk it up that Kitty switches because her X-Men didn't back her when she needed them most might have happened if she was in this event much. But not only the placing of this scene felt rushed, but the getting to it did as well. It was only a few story arcs earlier when the younger team were disgusted that Warren would join up with Cyclops. But now the remaining 4 are going to decide to go. Why not instead, I don't know, go back to your original time? That would pretty much solve every problem that this younger team has, and was the main reason that Warren joined up with Cyclops in the first place. As well, I have to say it again, Beast, good job. You were willing to potentially destroy the space-time continuum to bring the younger X-Men here, under the guise of it hopefully being the thing that would stop Cyclops. You were very stubborn in not helping them go back, and in the end, you just added to your enemy's ranks. No really, Beast, I mean it, great job. As a YouTuber, there's one thing I hate more than being corrected on something that wasn't even incorrect to begin with, and that's knowing that I'm wrong. Because, despite my reservations, All New had a great pace once Battle of the Atom had wrapped up. Somehow this rectified a lot of the problems that the earlier part of the run had with balancing so many characters and the different dynamics that come with it. I thought things would be glossed over to facilitate this rash decision, but we had a ton of great moments with the established Cyclops team and the all-new roster struggling to be in the same space. Jean standing up for herself against the Stepford sisters felt long overdue, since most people from this time kept judging her based on what she will do rather than who she is. Bendis even remembered that he set up a bizarre love triangle before Battle of the Atom started, and to give it some credit, it took a page from every teen drama and forced the triangle to know about each other. He made me feel for Scott, given how he was the one to go to the ends of the earth to protect Jean, and it turns out she went to Hank first. Kinda makes sense that he has a villain here now. What's best is that Bendis doesn't just abandon this storyline, but carries it on during the times when they're supposed to be training. Even with all the chaos going on, this still felt real. To them, this relationship is the most important thing that's going to be at the forefront of their minds. The teenagers, it's understandable, and this time it had more focus beyond just being an end of issue shock. Although I wanted a bit more from Warren. This was a team that had overruled him, forced him to join the opposition, but then when they caught up to him, he got one line and that's it. And again, everyone can't get the focus in this first issue, so it was just a relief that Magneto wasn't forgotten when he talks to Hank about the communication system. It's only a little scene, but given his presence up until now, I'll take it. There was also a great moment between Kitty and Magic, a dynamic that I only got more invested in the more that I saw them together. At first, it was hostile and frosty between the two of them, given the history that Kitty had with her brother, and I just like that Colossus was being mentioned again. What I think this boils down to is that Bendis can't afford to neglect the relationships between these characters, because when they're the focus, something about this series works. But the division between All New and Uncanny prior to this was due to the younger team, so as much as I was enjoying the character building, I couldn't help but wonder, why do we still have 2 series? Theoretically, it could be condensed into one title, and I think it'd be a lot cleaner. Yet speaking of clean, look at those new suits. Baby girl. As soon as I saw these, I was like, people are probably going to hate these, but I'm not one of them. Each one has a splash of identity while still solidifying them as a unit. There was a futuristic vibe to them while still not being a million miles away from what they were before. So I guess what I'm saying is, make some hot toys of them and I'm gonna buy them. This also helped the characters to have more presence during fights, which felt more cohesive now, and as if the team had found their rhythm with one another. Brandon Peterson takes over the art, a name I can't say I'm too familiar with, but I thought he did a great job. His action was bombastic and dynamic, the panels felt full of life and detailed, and the range of poses were phenomenal. There's even this really bizarre one that shows the full force of Hank's feet, and this one that looks like it was commissioned by the modern day Beast. Yet a unique curveball's thrown into the mix around this time that I wasn't expecting. X-23 is joining the team. Now, I love her character, and since Wolverine was already in 50 or so other titles around this time, or it may have even been during that year when he was dead, it made sense that the adamantium itch could be scratched by a different set of claws. flaws. But I wasn't too sure what Bendis was hoping would be added with her inclusion, beyond just having a recognisable name. It felt like she'd been speedrun through the regular trajectory of a new character, with her pretty much immediately joining up with Scott's team, barely asking any questions, and starting a fling with the guy who would go on to be the enemy of her father. I get Bendis wanted to do more with the wedge that's being driven between Scott and Jean, but I wish he'd be more subtle in bringing Scott and Laura together. Because you know what, that scene when they first talk and Scott awkwardly hugs her gave me hope for these two, but he needed more time and probably some distance from the Jean situation. I don't know much about where Laura was in her story before this, but it addressed her baggage in a way that didn't exclude me by not having that information, nor avoiding it altogether. If anything, it tied nicely into the arc that the all-new team was going through, as they were up against the Purifiers. I hadn't seen this team in a while before this run, and they hadn't left much of an impression on me, but they were quite memorable in this. It felt like a worthy threat for them to go up against, because the majority of their attack was weaponry and technology based, which the original X-Men wouldn't have had much experience against, unless Sentinels count. More so because he had this belief that they needed to rid the world of the mutant race, which was important for these younger mutants to deal with. It illustrated again how the enemy may change, but the motive doesn't. And for as electric as the fight against them was, and seeing the team get captured was fun, I wanted there to be a scene where the younger mutants try to figure out why they're still fighting. You could even have a scene where they discuss it with Cyclops, a guy who has very much gone through that journey. It just seems like that could have been an easy home run for this title, and the main reason why such a lesser opponent was chosen, but it refused to cross that finish line. But the longer that she's in this run, the more I understand why Jean often gets killed off. Because once she has telekinesis, it's very much game over. She is so overpowered that you can't just give the X-Men a lower level bad guy to go up against. Because even with her entire team captured, she can easily get them out single-handed. It makes you wonder why all these people who try it against the X-Men don't invest in Magneto helmets. I'd rather have one of them than some body armor. But as this team evolved, I liked how Kitty became more of a member than a mentor, and just highlighted that there was a huge difference between how the two teams are treated, so I get why there'd be a divide within the base. For all new, they got Kitty and Magic resolving the differences in order to train them, tours of the facility, new suits, whereas Uncanny is like the harshest military boot camp. I'm not sure what happened between issues, but Cyclops was a straight up dick to these students. He can claim it's under the guise of getting them ready, but he straight up assaults Ben and makes him trudge through the mud whilst barely wearing anything. Warren is still there in his original suit, and I don't get why he isn't just flying, but it does at least signpost that this must have been before the all new team joined back up. So I don't know, maybe taking care of his younger self changed Cyclops' ways, but regardless, Cyclops was so mean that it made Emma come across as a really warm mentor. This set up a really fun issue on the Uncanny side, where she helps Benjamin realise his usefulness within the team, and it kind of highlighted how Cyclops has lost his way. This dude can alter his appearance, will go on to be the new Morph. His usefulness shouldn't be in doubt, especially when his power set has already been seen and utilised with previous mutants. What good is Cyclops beating him up gonna do? Of course, it was all apparently part of his plan, but even after he's proven himself, Cyclops keeps insulting his fighting. But fun seemed to be at the forefront of Uncanny in the wake of Battle of the Atom, because beyond Ben's spy thriller style story, there was an enjoyable issue where all the girls have a day out shopping. It reminded me a lot of the double date issue from Tom King's Batman, and it just alleviated a lot of the baggage that these characters still had from before the switch. Slowly, the two teams were starting to come together, and it could have honestly gone for more relaxed issues like this, unless they also felt the need to connect to whatever event was going on at the time. Now, I'm no stranger to how this game works. If there's an event coming out, you've got to do a tie-in, and Bendis is one of the writers who should be most familiar with that. But my argument's always been that just because you're a tie-in, it shouldn't derail your story. Fortunately, this was only for one issue, but let's be honest. Who remembers Inhumanity? Where it's a nice little issue about the women of the team burying the differences and enjoying a day out. That's the kind of thing that can do wonders for a run. But still, I was all in for these shorter stories that didn't need to concern themselves with the larger world. Perfect example, when Bendis remembers that Magneto exists and gives us an entire issue following him on a personal mission. Especially with the Purifiers storyline that the all-new team were dealing with, Eric being at a rally and experiencing all that hatred towards mutants, but not being able to do anything about it, was illustrated so perfectly with the flashes of his mind. It's that idea that the real Magneto's still in there, but he has this fear that his power limitations would hold him back. It's an angle I wish had been explored more, especially since a few of the major players in this run were suffering with the same affliction. There could have been moments where the students wondered if they were more powerful than the teachers. Maybe consider an uprising. Give us a plot that shows why these long-standing characters have stood the test of time. But rather than focusing on what we don't get, I want to focus on this Magneto issue, as it was probably my favourite of Bendis' X-Men. The plot wasn't even that elaborate, it was just Eric following a lead he was given by Dazzler about what was going on in Madripoor, then him following the trail and realizing that he'd been duped by Mystique the entire time. So not only was it bringing the spotlight to the best character that had been largely forgotten, but also one of the interesting plot lines that had disappeared as well. What's best is that Bendis also highlighted the strength of character, with the way in which Magneto single-handedly took down the empire that she'd built, but in a convincing way and without powers. He could have just joined up with Mystique, and I thought that was the direction that Bendis was going to go in, so that Eric could return to his leader role, but instead he followed his own trajectory. There was a small moment before the big payoff where Eric's reaction to the loss of Xavier was brought into question, and for as interesting as it is, this should have been brought up way earlier in the run and been Magneto's arc. However, instead, it's the swan song for the character to launch the Cullen Bunn series. Now don't get me wrong, I'm probably going to end up reading that, but Magneto's already had such little presence in Bendis' X-Men that this move all but confirmed he won't get much attention in this run, despite being one of the most interesting characters in the mutant stratosphere. To me, it's like wanting to write Fantastic Four, but not doing anything with Doctor Doom. And it's a shame because this issue did so much right, and gave us a glimpse at what Bendis could have done with Magneto. Even Bakalow's artwork felt perfect for the experience, whereas there'd been a few times where it just didn't work. Like there'd been a few examples earlier where if we were looking at a close-up, I couldn't tell if it was Emma, Dazzler, Magic, or the blonde Stepford sister. There was another deja vu problem like that because I could have sworn, call me crazy if I'm wrong, that the Uncanny team were up against S.H.I.E.L.D. around this time, which would be daft considering how often it's happened already and not gone well for S.H.I.E.L.D. Sorry, I keep forgetting to give context, but the Uncanny students are sent to the Savage Land as part of their training, where Hijack, one of the newest members and possibly the most interesting student, draws the attention of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the non-cover-worthy Avengers, all because he kept his phone on. Magic manages to pull them back just in time, but Cyclops is not impressed, and I like this. It was a different type of story and a different type of pace, with the conflict being between teacher and student. And although the big moment with S.H.I.E.L.D. may have been seen before, it was interesting how we were seeing Cyclops stray into that grey area as a leader. I don't know if it was explicitly stated and I'm just saying the obvious here, but it almost felt as if he deliberately put the students in a situation where if one of them weren't following his rules, they would be discovered. Because honestly, Cyclops can say it was field training, but what was the actual task he set them? He hasn't been much of a teacher to any of the students in this run, but there was something about Hijack that seemed to irk him more than the others. Being real, I like to cutthroat Cyclops. One striking you out makes sense when they're already so on the back foot. And when he's speaking about teammates dying, you know it comes from experience. It was as if part of him resented what Xavier taught him, and was determined to do whatever he could to make sure that these students didn't experience what he had. And I told myself going into this that I was refusing to feel sympathy for Cyclops. So to have an issue focused on him, and how he feels in interactions with the people who are supposed to be on his team, did way more for me than I thought it would. This run could very much be called Everybody Hates Cyclops, and I can't imagine that that wouldn't have an effect on him. But it wasn't just seeing these moments, it was the quality of them as well. It was a fantastic scene with Kitty setting the rules on what her moving to Weapon X meant. Another where the young Jean pretty much shuns the fact that there's a world where she marries the man that Scott becomes. And a final one where he has a real heart-to-heart with his younger self. And it's great because it's one of those moments where I can't tell who benefited from it more. Really wish this had been longer than a page. I also wish it hadn't have needed to do a weird time skip flashback to facilitate this. The issue was set 2 weeks earlier when the all-new team first arrived at the Weapon X base, and I couldn't help but think, why not have this issue when that one released? The timeline between these two books is still just a bunch of question marks, and the Uncanny series kind of glossed over the two teams merging in the first place, whereas this issue would have been perfect then. But now it's just a great issue that unfortunately feels tacked on. But I can't leave this issue without talking about the phenomenal layouts. Now, when it comes to the art, a lot of the female faces could look a bit dollish, but the paneling across this issue was probably the best of the series. The twisting borders helped to illustrate the mind of Cyclops, and I wished more artists had experimented in this direction. Yet one thing that didn't require much experimentation was the trial of Jean Grey, where Battle of the Atom at least felt like it was important for all of the X titles. This wasn't that. Instead, it was a crossover with the Guardians of the Galaxy book that Bendis was writing at the same time, and I have some thoughts on it. If anything, it works as an antithesis to what was at the core of Battle of the Atom, because that was the story where the X-Men face the consequences of future decisions they're yet to make, whereas Trial focuses on Jean's past that she's yet to live through. The Shi'ar Empire get word that the younger Jean Grey is in their time and on Earth, and because of crimes committed against their people while she was under the Phoenix Force, they decide to detain her and hold her accountable for crimes that she has technically technically committed, but she's yet to commit personally. It's basically the Minority Report, but with Jean Grey at the centre, which is the exact type of idea that these time-displaced students should be thrown into, and it got off to a strong start. For as much as it may sound like the worst, the bickering between the students felt organic and was reminiscent of how well Bendis did this kind of thing during Ultimate Spider-Man. The argument Jean and Scott had with Warren in between them was both funny and hard to watch unfold. It doesn't forget how they've got great abilities that also worsen the personal lives. Like, let's be honest, if we could read minds, we'd be doing it left, right and centre to see what people think of us, and at the same time, how can Scott not be thinking about Jean? Which gives us this recipe for disaster. That had been marinating for a while, but what hadn't is how Jean now all of a sudden can't cope with seeing her future self die. She was pretty fine with it for the last arc, and even had a girl's day out where she didn't seem to have a care in the world, but now it's consuming her every living thought. But when the army do come to abduct Jean, it gives us a great battle that really had me excited for this whole crossover. The paneling and layouts were exciting. Every X-Man got a chance to shine, and it felt more tense because they weren't coming to kill or take over the world. They just wanted Jean, and given the title of the arc, I had a sneaking suspicion they were going to succeed. The Guardians show up, and despite how obvious the intention behind this crossover was, when they're there on the page, I can't deny how hyped I was for this. I at first feared that half of this event was going to be breadcrumbs just to get the two teams in the same room. Like, one barely comes to Earth, and the other exclusively lives here, so the fact that they bypassed all of that in the first part gave me high hopes. But then we get an issue with the Guardians, and we're back in space with no X-Men in sight. But that's fine. Nothing to worry about. Surely, this was just so anyone who wasn't reading X-Men knew what was going on. Not everything can be for the readers of all new. I understand that. And then there's part 3. And this issue was what it would look like if comics had loading screens. Trial of Jean Grey is only 6 parts, or 5 if you're taking the word of part 3's cover. Yet, nearly half of it is spent on either waiting around to get to a destination, or waiting around before the trial starts, and I can't see it as anything other than a massive missed opportunity. Time wasn't really on this event's side, but when it did finally kick off in the last part, it was fun. But these two completely polar opposite teams spent the majority of their time together sat making small talk that is far more bland than I would expect. As well, I'd understand that if there were two different writers on the separate titles, but without reading the Guardians book alongside this, the dialogue of those guys felt far too clunky, as if they were a parody of themselves and just ticking boxes so that you wouldn't get suspicious. Maybe I'm gonna have to see how that series holds up. I don't mean to bag on this crossover, and I don't want to do that for any comic that I spend my free time on, but I do reckon this plot could have worked well if it had found a way to cross over with the Uncanny team instead, or maybe just one of the other X titles. But so far it felt like the all-new squad had joined up with Cyclops specifically to not work with him, and just go about things with the same people that they had been with beforehand. But I can't sit here and pretend it's all bad. Scott meeting his dad was heartwarming, and some of the best scenes amongst this blockade of isolated moments were between these two characters chatting in space. There's even a bit of dialogue where he says that Scott's making all the same mistakes with Jean, giving that sense that history is always destined to repeat itself. Gladiator was in this and confirmed what I said in my Marvel Iceberg video, that he is the biggest jobber in the 616 universe. His contribution in this is exposition in the beginning and then immediately getting wiped out by Jean. And one of the most surprising developments was between Kitty and Star-Lord. With just 2 pages, Bendis had me fully shipping these. Gamora and Colossus who? It's been a bit of a sobering journey reading this run and realising how this very well may have been the turning point in the career of the writer who got me into comics in the first place. But say what you want about him, Bendis' power is his ability to make me buy into unlikely romances for Kitty Pryde. And it wasn't just for this crossover. There was another great accidentally hilarious moment during the trial when Jean's defense mentions no less than 4 times on one page that Gladiator wiped out Jean's family. So all in all, trial left me feeling a bit empty. It wasn't all bad, but the whole thing felt like a massive missed opportunity. Like, there's a panel towards the end where Bobby says, "Wait, what?" And that epitomised how I felt about this crossover. Oh yeah, are you wondering the reason why he said that? It's because Scott decides to leave the team for space adventures with his dad. From an emotional standpoint, it makes sense. The guy thought that he was never going to see his father again. And from a business standpoint, it was to launch a young Cyclops series which I'm not at all interested to read. I take it back, the scenes together weren't that good. But it does beg the question, what's going on in this run? In the space of a few issues, we've gone from an event which was all about how destructive it is for the mutants to stay outside the timeline, to them switching sides because we were almost forced to go back, to them now having no concern concern for what could happen. What if the other 4 got sent back? What good would it be not having Cyclops nearby, let alone going off planet? Yeah, at least I didn't know the answer to all those questions, whereas Uncanny presented me with what could have been an exciting concept if it hadn't been seen as recently as 2 issues earlier, the Uncanny X-Men vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. An idea that very much could have been the climax of this series if the outcome hadn't been the same every time they've come head to head so far, or at a pass if the supposed underdog in this scenario, Cyclops' team, were at least on the losing end up until now. Anybody else find it odd as well that only the first part announced it as Uncanny X-Men vs. S.H.I.E.L.D.? But regardless of if it was treading water, it was at least showing me a different ocean, because it tried to tie in all of the plot lines that had been ongoing so far, and I was happy to see that. Hijack got some page time, we saw that Mystique still had Dazzler held captive, and all of it connected with what was going on with S.H.I.E.L.D. rather than just being filler. And from the very first part, it did great legwork to solidify that Cyclops was once again a badass. For as much as I complained that there hadn't been a plan for this revolution of his, Cyclops was now at least taking more action, and it made me appreciate some of the things he'd been doing this whole time and had glossed over. The storyline starts with him monitoring Cerebro, hoping to discover mutants at the moment that they develop. One with huge energy pops up in Chicago, so he and the team go there, only to realise it was a trap where Sentinels are waiting for them. The way Cyclops warded off this attack was amazing to see, and Magic was in that same boat with how well they used their powers. Kinda makes me wonder why they even brought the students. But the attack wasn't the point of this issue, it was how it led to Cyclops finally being tipped over the edge. His initial assumption is that S.H.I.E.L.D. organised the whole thing, but he can't be certain. With the whole world against them, and their every move being predicted, and sick of feeling like a target's on the back, Cyclops declares war. And I was very much rolling my eyes at this point. Not because I didn't like the idea, but because for over 20 issues now, I'd been hearing Cyclops saying that he would lead a revolution, but was mostly just waiting in his base. Yet this time, and to my disbelief, he meant action. The very next issue, he teleports straight into the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier and the Jean Grey school to get some answers. And this played out like a mystery that I really could have bought into, if they didn't all but confirm from the first part that it was employed by the Blockbuster Sentinel. It's probably for the best that they did that, because I'd forgotten he was even part of this story since Battle of the Atom happened, just after he appeared. Worse so, the reveal that the man behind the suit was Beast, but from the Age of Apocalypse universe was so underwhelming. That brings the total number of Hank McCoys that appear in this run up to 4, and at least 3 of them are villains. As well, did this scene remind anybody else of the Doc Ock storyline in Matt Fraction's Invincible Iron Man? The way this comes out is because Cyclops going to the Jean Grey school also lets S.H.I.E.L.D. know exactly where they are. Another attack is launched on them with no one knowing who was behind it, at least until the present day Beast connects the dots. This guy has been a presence for a good number of issues now. Not a good enough one for me to remember him, but still. As is the mystery around his identity, or for him to just die as soon as he comes face to face with Cyclops. If I'm trying to understand what the motive may have been, I'm drawing a blank. Was it to confirm that regardless of which reality they're in, Beast is always going to hate Cyclops? Or to remind us that there are worse versions of these characters within the multiverse? But I'm not sure what's more repetitive, new versions of Beast showing up, or the dialogue when Hijack comes back to save the day. With the helicarrier mounting its assault, the guns are stopped with everyone, and I mean literally everyone within a 10-mile radius, getting their moment to ask, who on earth could have stopped them? For God's sake, it's Hijack. You know, the guy who we saw at the beginning of the issue, the only mutant we know in this story who can interfere with technology, the one who never wanted to leave the team in the first place and was desperate to prove himself. It's him. Also known as the most obvious fucking guess. Bendis didn't need to give us 3 pages of mystery with it all, and could have used that to give us a real confrontation between Cyclops and Dark Beast. Because without Dark Beast, the only threat present in this moment is pretty much identical to the one at the end of Battle of the Atom. Just because you change the location to the Jean Grey school doesn't mean it's a completely different scenario. Even I'm not that gullible. So what we're left with instead is a bunch of loose ends getting wrapped up in a really unsatisfying way, and there never being a proper payoff to the Uncanny X-Men vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. storyline. Beyond the stuff with Dark Beast, the Dazzler, Mystique, Madripoor storyline returns, and I thought this would be something resolved in the Magneto series, so I was disappointed it cropped back up here when another storyline was trying to reach its potential. But what did reach its potential without just feeling like a glorified art book was a 25th issue showcase and all new. Now don't get me wrong, I didn't really consider 25 issues to be worthy of a celebration, but this at least did bring in some superstar talent for the pinups and found a way to craft a story around it. Sure, it's centered around Beast, who I thought wasn't really in this series anymore since the younger students had left the Jean Grey school, but who's keeping track anymore? He can't sleep because he's finally considering the consequences of his actions and talking about it with a bold shadowed figure. And from page 1 it pissed me off with how in denial Beast is, as he justifies his decisions as if he did prevent a genocide. But as we've seen, Cyclops didn't have a plan for one anyway. Like, congratulations, you prevented the nothing that didn't happen from still not happening. Yet there was some fantastic art in this, and it was intriguing getting that insight into exactly what Beast was thinking. That the fear of there being no X-Men drove him to make such a colossal decision, and I didn't see the twist at the end coming where this whole time he's been speaking to the Watcher. I guess all bald guys don't look the same. But after Battle of the Atom and the trial of Jean Grey, the all-new series needed a new direction, and I was curious how this book could go on with Scott now swanning off in his own series. That direction came in the form of the future Brotherhood that we saw during Battle, and immediately I thought this would have been better had they not been the focus of that whole event. Like, I've already seen them go up against the collective might of the entire X-Men, so what can it be shown with them against the younger team that I haven't already seen? Pretty naive way of thinking there for myself, because this managed to zero in the focus on the younger students that I felt had been overlooked during Battle of the Atom. I really enjoyed the scene that kicked this off, where Jean's having a nightmare of her killing her friends with the Phoenix Force. She wakes up and Cyclops is there. They have a long overdue conversation about destiny, changing our fates, and again, it was one of those moments where one was talking in fear of the future, whereas you could tell that the other is just regretting the past. It was quite sweet and tell it straight into nonce territory. Jean says she likes the older him more than the one that she went out with, and I can guarantee that she wouldn't be saying that to Beast. And also, all you've seen of the older Cyclops is him berating his students, so how bad must your Scott be? And for the record, Cyclops doesn't make an advance or anything and shuts it down immediately. Not that Kitty cared. It's just a bit weird and uncomfortable and reminiscent of what happened with that maths teacher at my high school. At least it was better than when we had to hear Beast's thoughts about the teenage Jean, so it's just another advantage to Cyclops. And it reminds me of the time traveler's wife, because this is the girl he has those memories of marrying. The woman he wished had never died in his arms. That must be confusing for the guy. But I just still don't like how two of the adult teachers in this story have had weird thoughts about Jean. What's more confusing is that Cyclops is even in this arc. I could have sworn this was taking place at the same time he was being attacked at the Jean Grey school, so where's the guy really? Someone should probably check that he's not actually Mystique. This setup with the Weapon X school being taken over and forced into a lockdown would have been an ideal way to disguise Cyclops' absence. And I just can't believe it's Bendis who's allowing himself to be tripped up so easily. Yet tripping ourselves up was kind of the theme of this arc, as the crux of it all centers around Xavier of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants constantly trialing different plans and learning from what went wrong to devise a different attack. I kept wondering if it was toying with the idea of reaping what you sow, since the Beast of the 616 universe was comfortable with messing with the past in the first place. And now there's a different version of his character doing the same to his time. Yet of course, Beast isn't the one dealing with the consequences. The time traveling was one of those elements that added to this band of villains, since they weren't just this new threat that had appeared, it was part of a long timeline that had been building in a future we'd only scratched the surface of. There was that chance to plug the gap for ourselves, and envision how many trials they must have done, and how many they were willing to try. To my surprise, I also didn't hate the twist that Xavier had the entire team under mind control to enact this plan. The dude's powerful. That's obvious, and being from the bloodline of Charles Xavier, I'd expect nothing less, with it only adding to his allure as a leader. But then all the questions started. Does he have to do this every second of the day? What if he gets knocked out? What about when he's sleeping? Does the mind control still work? Does he shut off their brains when he's gonna sleep and then activate them again when he wakes up? What if he's like me and takes an impromptu nap? Does he have to mind control them to pee, or do they pee on their own? What if they needed pee in the night? What if Xavier needs to pee in the night? What if I started to need a pee in the night? But in a way, there's a tragedy behind this. That Xavier's lineage would go down such a dark route to have to force mutants to follow his lead and do his bidding. Sure, Charles Xavier could be manipulative, but never to the extent of mentally enslaving his fellow mutants. You're probably wondering though, if it's Xavier mind controlling them, how can I say this beast is evil? Well, I guess he could have ripped up the note that was pushed under the door in issue 29 or something. But it's nice in a way, because I started this part confused by the inclusion of Laura, and wondering what she might possibly add to this run. But by this point I'd realised that there hadn't been a time where she felt out of place, or that she hadn't added to the storyline. This future Brotherhood arc really was a showcase for her. If anything, it made me ask why they hadn't thrown her into this run sooner. The tenacity, the rage was something that we'd only really gotten when Jean channeled the Phoenix, so she really improved the action, and highlighted how that element had been lacking. As well, amidst the mess that was the Hank, Jean and Scott triangle, I was glad this arc ended with her and Warren embracing spontaneity and driving off together. Wait, Warren? Since when the hell were they a thing? Did I read a different book? I could have sworn she was hung up on Scott. You know what, this development baffled me so much that I traced back through all the issues. And the last thing that Laura said to Warren prior to this scene where they drive off into the unknown together was, "I don't know you." Those were the exact words. Am I supposed to be rooting for these two? I can't even say it's a car crash waiting to happen like Hank and Jean, it's just Warren and Laura, and maybe this baffling coupling sums up Bendis' entire time on X-Men. I don't know anymore. Maybe I've been a bit disingenuous up until now, for as much as bagging on the baffling parts of this run as being quite therapeutic, that doesn't mean I wasn't enjoying most of what I was reading. I can't say it was written phenomenally, or even in line with who these characters are, but there was something entertaining about going through a run that I had zero clue where it was going. Case in point, The Last Will and Testament of Charles Xavier. Now canonically, I could have sworn that Charles had been dead for at least 6 months now, and maybe they explained why it took so long for anyone to realise there was a will and I just glossed over it, but better late than never. This was Uncanny's way of connecting to Original Sin, which was the Marvel event of that year where the majority of the characters across the Marvel universe learned or revealed a secret about their past that would shock audiences, all of which were coming to light following the death of the Watcher, who I recently remember being in the same room as Beast. And I don't know how the death of the Watcher produced a will for Xavier, but here we are, and I was excited. I still remember how Tony Stark was revealed to be involved with the gamma test that turned Bruce Banner into the Hulk, and well, honestly, that's the only one that really stuck with me, but I was hopeful that Bendis was going to add something juicy. I have to give it respect as well for finding a way to connect with the company-wide event, while still developing the threads happening for the X-Men. Long story short, She-Hulk is a lawyer in charge of reading the will, which is a clever way of bringing the two divided teams back together. It was also fun seeing She-Hulk solely in a professional capacity, without her getting roped into some kind of fight. But honestly, I'd forgotten how Original Sin pretty much only existed to make her hate a hero, because lo and behold, the will reveals that Xavier had spent most of his life protecting the world from an Omega level mutant by gaslighting him. Now I don't doubt that Xavier must have some skeletons in his closet, but this is the first thing in his will. He couldn't have trusted one person from the team with this knowledge beforehand, and he thought the easiest way to resolve this would be to leave it in his will that clearly there'd been such little planning in place they didn't even get read until months after his death. But contrivances aside, as a way of navigating around Original Sin, it was a good way of doing it as it forced Wolverine and Cyclops to talk to one another. It also reinforced that despite their differences and many fights, Charles is still more important than all of that. But because Charles' will specified that Logan and Cyclops had to work together, I like to imagine that he wrote this after Schism and he was just trying to cause some mischief. We spend a lot of time going through Charles' history with Matthew, the mutant who's the danger to the planet, and also discovering his abilities at the exact same time as the will being read. And honestly, it was only interesting to me as it gave us an insight into the lengths that Xavier went to gaslight this kid. But if they wanted me to think that Matt is an interesting character, then they're gonna need an Xavier to mess with my head. But it was very much one of those arcs where I was more interested in what it meant for the wider scope, because it went on for way longer than it should have done. It did set up some great moments in the following arc, but this had almost as much of the focus, and there was just way too much time spent on flashbacks. Whereas the main thing it kept me thinking was, how come Beast knew where Cyclops was this entire time but didn't tell anyone? There were more than a few instances where that would have been useful. And I'm just saying, that sounds like something a villain would do, and I really wasn't a fan of the art in some of these issues. It was a bit too flat and almost had like a free webcomic vibe to it. The colouring was nice, and there are instances where this simplistic look can work, but for a storyline about Xavier's will, it just doesn't sit right. I get that this thing is in the eye of the beholder, but I could not get past this panel where Rachel looked minuscule compared to Beast, because there's no kind of perceptional shadows. To give them credit, there were some decent panels and pages when they came back for the Omega Mutant arc, so maybe they just needed to warm up or have a storyline where they could display a bit more range. What was great here was the cover to issue 26. I promise, I'm not being biased here because of the last name, but I wish we could have got something like this in the actual issue, as we'd been building up to another interesting idea with Wolverine and Cyclops being forced to work together again, but instead, a lot of the focus was spent on the students. Sure, there was a fun scene where the students were in a simulation going up against the Avengers, so Bendis at least found a way to make it a fun read, even if I was more concerned with how things were unfolding with an Omega level mutant. But there was a great angle that they brought up that I hadn't considered. Why are the students being forced to prepare to fight the Avengers? There's a large laundry list of villains that they could have pretended to fight, but for me it gave insight into the fact that maybe Cyclops doesn't think that everything is over on that front. Although to me, just further evidence of the fact that I only found these students interesting when it tied back to their teachers, rather than them being interesting in their own right. Only further confirmed by the fact that when the focus was put on Cyclops, and him figuring out an approach towards Matthew, it was really interesting. Some great work was done with Cyclops' anger at Xavier for keeping this a secret for his whole life, and I think that was more because he was still struggling and trying to find justification for the fact that he'd killed Charles. And it's bizarre hard too because this whole situation overshadowed the fact that Xavier had married Mystique, and I was happy for it because I don't even know what to think about that. Even Iceman got the spotlight for a moment and echoed the sentiments that other members of his team were probably also feeling. I know people had issues with the way that his character was written, both the modern and past versions, but this wasn't a bad moment. But the best parts of this arc were when it focused on Cyclops, as not as much was done with the idea of him working with Wolverine again. It was mostly Rachel who did the legwork for these guys. It was a cheap gimmick, but making every hero appear in front of Matthew was a fun spectacle, and seeing the plan come crashing down around him was entertaining, and the entire plan seemed to rely on the fact that Matthew doesn't watch the news and know that Xavier's already dead. Yet for as dull as he was, Bendis did manage to convey quickly just how powerful Matthew is, which made Xavier right to be concerned. Although he very much could have chose a different approach over the years, and it seems that different approach is the one that Cyclops chose to take. I feel it was framed a bit disingenuously to make it seem like he was just being a conniving, manipulative guy, when all he was doing was taking the direct approach and willing to accept Matthew for who he is. Like up till now, Bendis had done a good job of straying within that grey area, but now I'm wondering who he wanted to come out looking like the good guy. I know it wouldn't have been possible with when Original Sin came out, but a storyline like this would have worked wonders for Cyclops' position as this leader of a revolution had it happen closer to the beginning of the run. When he's narrating his own history with Xavier, it gave his current stance more weight because of how deep his perspective runs. You can feel the venom in his words when he talks about taking their place in society. All of the attributes that could have made him a ruthless villain or a dominant leader are on display here, whereas prior to this we got a guy who got knocked out in one hit and kept trying to get into fights with kids, whereas this issue was just about Cyclops trying to coerce Matthew to join his side. And it was possibly the most tense moment of the entire run. You had that high risk, high reward element. This was the missing piece of that puzzle because if they did work together, nothing and no one could stop Cyclops. Yet at the same time, he's the only one who dared to brave the wasteland and speak to Matthew in person. But it's unfortunate because at this stage, the book seemed intent on Cyclops just being a villain, so we don't really get to see what the dynamic would look like. This whole arc is just everyone telling Cyclops he's wrong, and there's no nuance to it like there was in the past. From Emma berating him for not wanting to go on the mission in the first place, Iceman blaming everything on him and not throwing any shade at Beast for creating a lot of the problems since Xavier's death, and even Magneto came back just to tell him he's gone too far. We can just add this to the list of moments where these two don't agree with each other, but had these two been more of a unit building up to this moment, and not having Magneto dipping out every chance he gets, it could have been like the moment in Hickman's Avengers when Cap confronts Stark about the truth. Oh wait, so there is another Original Sin reveal that I remember. Similar to Battle of the Atom, there was a lot here that felt like it could have been the closing arc for the Uncanny series, especially with how late it was all happening. Had they done more with Cyclops beforehand in making those decisive moves towards his revolution, this could have been the one thing that he did that went too far. And if you've been watching since part 1, you'll remember I said that time travel did nothing but cause problems for this run the longer that it went on, all of which came to a head here, with the world in chaos, the leaders of the revolution having been obliterated, and a battle seeming to brew between the two schools. Either one of the new students who could create time bubbles goes in the past and visits Xavier so that they can stop the Matthew problem before it began. I had my hopes that Bendis would find an inventive way to use time travel to solve this issue without it feeling lazy or contradicting the rules that have been set up already about time travel. But I was wrong and it did both. I'd hoped it would Back to the Future and find a way to still ensure the storyline played out the way it had done, but maybe have like an ultimate failsafe in place. Yet instead, Xavier and Eva just stopped Matthew's parents from ever meeting by planting self-doubt in his father's head. This feels really mean. What was your backup plan? Were you going to convince him he had erectile dysfunction? And let's address the even larger elephant in the room. Eva can now time travel and alter the course of the timeline. Like, yeah, that makes sense. It's a natural evolution of her powers, sure. But why is this the one time she uses this? She could have prevented Xavier's death in the first place, which would have also sorted out the Matthew problem. How about meeting up with Beast just before he brings the 60s X-Men to the present, and stopping the avalanche of problems that gave us? Then you've got the fact that once the Matthew dilemma is resolved, Xavier's asked directly if he's concerned about the butterfly effect, and he seems to just assume that everything's going to work out perfectly. And I'm more annoyed because it does. It was definitively established through Scott dying for a moment that altering anything about the past will have a knock-on effect to the present, except this doesn't. Logically, if this was a learning curve for Xavier, and his greatest secret shame, besides marrying Mystique apparently, shouldn't there be something else that replaces that if Matthew now doesn't exist? Is there another mutant that he knew of that just wasn't as powerful as Matthew, so it never took his focus? If he didn't learn from this scenario, how does he not do the same thing when Jean Grey turns into the Phoenix? I'm also not going to try and unravel the fact that changing this one thing that significantly impacted the way that Xavier taught mutants and led his X-Men still resulted in a world where Schism happened, AVX happened, and pretty much everything happened the exact same way. I get it was a secret he kept, but this was the first thing he mentioned in his will, yet not having this part of his history meant absolutely nothing to him. This was supposed to be the thing that brings Wolverine and Cyclops back on the same page, but we barely got any of that. Everyone kind of failed, and then one of the students who'd had barely any of the focus was now the one to save all of the X-Men. There's something super lazy about having a world-ending threat just be prevented with time travel, especially since now there must be some kind of way that Ava could develop her powers more to be able to take the time-displaced students back, but that would actually solve the biggest hurdle of this run, so there's no point trying. Oh, but maybe I'm being too harsh, because the time traveling did somehow erase Charles' marrying Mystique, or at least made him not include it in his will for some reason. No idea how that was Matt's fault. But if this was gonna have zero impact on the series, why even have it in here? There was already a run-killing precedent set up in Battle of the Atom. 2, if I'm remembering right. But now, just before this run rounds the final corner, an even more dangerous one is added. Anything can be reversed through time travel. It almost goes against the only theme I could find up until this point, and the next arc should pretty much just be Eva going through time and reversing every misfortune that befell mutants. Go reverse House of M, Avengers vs X-Men, do the other heroes a favour and tell them who was a Skrull during Secret Invasion. I'm not saying they should be tampering with the timeline, but what happened in this arc that would discourage Eva from doing it again? She, ironically, got out of it scot-free. That's a joke because she decides to leave Cyclops' team after this. The magic learning from Doctor Strange thread also came back in this arc because it led to her bringing the Eye of Agamotto with her before they were all obliterated and it meant nothing. And the two constantly toy with, should I tell you this? Is it right to know about that? Yet similar to the Eva situation, there are no consequences that we ever see. And this plotline kind of seems to have no point in the end. The only good thing to come out of this whole cheap solution is that the will wasn't just full of burden now, and it still managed to hit an emotional note because everything was originally meant to go to Cyclops, showing just how much love and hope Xavier had for the man who would be his demise. He did the right thing though and allowed it to defer to Storm, so there is a somewhat happy ending. Just wasn't that much of a happy beginning, and I'm talking about the cover, which clearly shows Havoc strangling Cyclops off the side of a building in downtown New York, in an issue that doesn't feature Havoc at all, nor anyone strangling Cyclops, and goes nowhere near downtown. But it's been a while since I spoke about All New, and I'm just glad I get to spend some time with my favourite couple, Laura and Warren. I'm just so glad I had no judgment towards this at the end of the last part, and that I 100% backed this, because I have to admit, there was a lot of chemistry between the two of them. We get a montage of them travelling together and flying out to clubs, which did far more to convince me of these two as a couple than anything that Bendis tried when Scott was in the picture. Makes me wish we hadn't spent any time with that redundant thread, since it would have given Warren a storyline earlier. There's also a nice scene where we pick back up with Kitty and Quill, but honestly, I thought Bendis had forgotten about this plotline up until now. It's why I found it funny how she says everyone makes fun of her for dating a hologram because no one's even mentioned they were a thing since Trial. But it seemed to be an entire issue of Bendis improving the bridges between a lot of the characters here, because the crux of it centered around Jean and Emma. They finally started the psychic training after what feels like 20 or so issues of saying it was going to happen. And what's great is they really went through this journey of hating each other to slowly forming some respect. I don't get how Bendis managed to do it in just one issue, but by the end, I wanted to see more of these two together. It's just a shame, and I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record, but yet again the release order just threw me out of this, because the cliffhanger to this issue was Beast and Storm showing up at the school to summon Scott for the reading of Xavier's will, like there's some kind of shocking secret to be revealed, even though release order meant I'd already read the issues of Uncanny that chronologically shouldn't have even happened yet. It's not the biggest crime with this reading order, and it's my fault for not predicting it by now, but I can't say it wasn't throwing me out of the run. That hurdle aside, Bendis found a way to convincingly leave the 60s X-Men out of the will reading, and conveniently all the time meddling that followed. A new mutant appears on the radar with a large reading, and with the professors gone, the younger team takes it upon themselves to steal a Blackbird to do the interception, as apparently this is what they do, despite never leading any of these interventions. And one of the only ones who were present for was that one that turned out to be a ruse by Blockbuster Sentinel and resulted in no new mutant being recruited. But all that aside, I have to admire the confidence. The new mutant in question, Carmen, can create portals to different dimensions but has no control over her ability. So when the X-Men intercept her, they're sent to the Ultimate Universe. And this grabbed my attention. Again, just like throwing in the older X-Men, it's a cheap, easy gimmick, but I had so little clue where any of this was going, and they already should have gone home 20 issues ago, so you know what? Why not see how they fare in a different universe as well? And what says Ultimate Universe more than the character who didn't even debut until 10 years after the imprint started? Jean Grey immediately crosses paths with Miles Morales, but this was during that era before Into the Spider-Verse where there was next to no difference between him and Peter Parker. You know, beyond their ethnicity.
He's out of line. but he's right.
Bobby finds himself underground and confronted by Ultimate Mole Man, despite not knowing much of the regular Mole Man to notice if anything is different. Beast is in Latveria and confronted by Dr. Doom, Warren ends up in the Savage Lands, and Laura appears in the middle of an American football game, but like, the ultimate version of that? I won't act like this whole arc is a waste of time, but if the majority of the characters are meeting the ultimate version of the characters they don't know anyway, why not just keep them in the 616 universe? But I honestly reckon a storyline with Jean teaming up with the regular Peter Parker would have read the exact same, except for that scene with Genki, because there is such little effort made to change Miles' speech or personality, and you can hate me all you want for saying it. I did like that we got another one of those fantastic double-page spreads when Jean reads Miles' mind, even if it does disprove my theory that the lack of them meant that she was controlling her powers better, but still, I'm glad they're getting the money's worth from that layout. There was a sense of comfort that came with Bendis writing within the Ultimate Universe again, and the humour carried a lot of this through. I know Bobby doesn't act much like the one that we know, but it tickled me when he highlighted that prejudice towards mutants is an odd stance to take when there's a literal mole monster beneath them, and considering the liberties that were taken with other characters, I think making Bobby the comedic relief isn't the most egregious crime. I'd take that over a Jean-Hank love story any day. Bobby was kinda just the Mikey of the team, and since I'm rewatching the 2012 TMNT currently, I don't mind that. By the way, let me know if I can get away with doing a video on that series because I love it so much. I also found it funny how Laura and Warren arrive at the Weapon X base at the exact same time so that she can save him from James, who has apparently been tracking the Flying Angel all the way from Antarctica. Like, I get he's got enhanced senses, but damn, how distinct must Warren's smell be? Of course, so later on we do get a scene of the X-Men meeting the Ultimate X-Men, and another example of that memory overload page because that template really must have cost them something. But surprisingly, I don't really have much of a point to make with this arc. It's neither great nor bad, and just follows a very obvious setup of the team desperately trying to find a way to get back to their own world, which if anything is out of character since they don't have any concern about not being in their own time. It's ironic because the whole thing felt more like an advertisement for Miles Morales than it did an X-Men story. So it's fun in the sense that it shows how quickly things have changed for his character. I only say that because they very much could have left him in New York, so I see the plan at work. And it was fun seeing him team up with the X-Men to take on Doom's army, which is the climax of this story. The way this comes about is because once Jean meets the Ultimate X-Men, they locate the other displaced mutant, but Doom managed to get Hank under mind control, which given his track record in this series, I don't think he would have needed much convincing. When the team arrived to save Hank, the whole of Latveria descends into a battlefield. And you know what? This was pretty entertaining. The action had that large-scale feel to it, as if Bendis knew he could get away with more here because other heroes wouldn't get involved. The Doombots gave them cannon fodder to unleash their powers without becoming murderers, and it's just a shame that it was over way too easily. Again, Jean's just way too overpowered for a conflict to have stakes. But even if this is the Ultimate Universe, that's still Dr. Doom. Show some respect. You're not going to be affecting the regular Doom, so let this one take a bit more of a stand. The fight was decent as well, so give us more of that. In an all too convenient swoop, Carmen, the mutant who sent them to the Ultimate Universe in the first place, shows up once again and manages to control the powers enough to get them back to the 616 universe, leading me to wonder what the mutants could have done to help her in the first place. But Hank's seen too much. Yet another universe where mutants are hated. His thoughts run rampant, so much so that he daren't say them out loud, and only Jean can hear him. But that genuinely fascinating idea doesn't get the spotlight for longer than a cliffhanger, and what we do end on is a phenomenal issue all focused around Emma training Jean out in Madripoor. I can't lie, when I saw the cover, I wasn't hopeful since the art looked similar to that random issue in the middle of Casey's Thor, but for once the cover clickbait worked in my favour. Like, look at this. This cover is clearly Hank and Bobby in some kind of lab, and they don't appear in this issue at all. And that's probably for the best, as this may be my favourite style in the entire series, and shows how an artist can bring a completely different vibe to a story. It was somehow quite realistic, but also had this watercolour look to it. There was softness in the faces, but then the streets were smoggy and riddled with dirt, and that juxtaposition is almost symbolic of what we get with these two characters. The story was simple yet compelling, of Jean and Emma going into the criminal underworld of Madripoor and uprooting a scheme Blob had going on. It was up there with that Magneto issue, which makes me wonder if the secret to this series working was doing a one-shot story in Madripoor. But this built on what I enjoyed most about their dynamic earlier on. It wasn't just about putting a modern character with a past era one and hoping that that was enough, but instead building a relationship between the two that there hadn't been an opportunity for in the regular history. It was expanding on tensions whilst also finding common ground to weave a new story. It's just disappointing that Bendis hadn't put more focus on this earlier on. This should have been the bank of stories to borrow from once that younger team had switched sides. People may say better late than never, but I can't help but wonder what the legacy of this run would have been if it had zeroed in in on the things that were enjoyable. What if something like this Jean and Emma story hadn't have been saved until the end of the run? Wait, what? This still isn't the end? Who was Black Vortex for? No, seriously, who wanted this? I wanted to start this part with some elegant sounding intro, but why? With just 4 issues left in the series, All New got roped into another crossover that adds nothing to the storyline. Similar to the trilogy in Grey, this was between All New X-Men and Guardians of the Galaxy, 2 titles solely written by Bendis, taking place in an event that Bendis wasn't even writing the main issues for. Worse so, was I supposed to have been reading Guardians the entire time alongside this? This crossover happens quite late in both series, so I can't imagine it wouldn't spoil some of the developments if I was to just jump into it now. At the same time, there's no clear reading order for the 2 X-Men books that Bendis wrote, so how would adding in a third, mostly unrelated book help with any of that? The plot revolves around a mirror known as the Black Vortex that billions of years ago was gifted by a Celestial to a race called the Viscardi. This mirror can give those who submit to it the power of a Celestial, which causes the Viscardi to war against each other until they're extinct. Star-Lord learns of this, and after being saved by Kitty, the two decide to make sure that it doesn't get into the hands of Mr. Knife, which sounds like a name you'd hear in a bad creepypasta, and they recruit the respective teams. Yep, the relationship between Star-Lord and Kitty that I enjoyed came back to haunt me, as they were the only reason this storyline existed in the first place. At least in the All New issues, Bendis utilised their time well, by giving them a good handful of scenes together where the chemistry between them still felt legit and took them beyond just being a long distance fling. Other than that, from the second that I saw the reading order and that the whole thing took place off planet, I had a sneaking suspicion that the only real development would be Scott joining back up with his original team. And just like a broken clock, for one moment, I was right. But it also comes with a confession, because out of this whole thing, I only read the Alpha issue and the ones for All New. Part of this was me making a stand that I wouldn't accept some lazy last minute crossover. But another part of it was because the Alpha issue didn't really do anything for me, wasn't written by Bendis, and at the end of the day, I'm reviewing his X-Men run. Those issues count as parts 4 and 5, but they should just be labelled pre-Scott's return and post-Scott's return, because it feels like the entirety of those issues just has characters waiting around for that moment, but sprinkles in a shit ton of jargon and exposition before that. Hand on heart, if you're reading All New, you will lose nothing by missing all the Black Vortex. Even the other X-Men don't seem to care much about Scott being back. There's just one awkward scene between him and Jean to show that he's now got ample riz, but everyone else seems to have as little surprise about his return as I did. In the very next issue of All New after Black Vortex, there is no sense that anything is different besides Scott rejoining, and Warren having some badass cosmic wings and a suit that looks like one of the alternate versions of Lord Draken. But that's it. There's a mention that Kitty now lives off planet, but that's contradicted by an issue of Uncanny I read just before this one that still took place after Black Vortex. Long story short, don't get distracted by this long-winded detour of a crossover when you're this close to the finish line. The only real thing you'd be missing out on is some crisp Andrea Sorrentino art. This was a nice surprise inclusion this late on in the run. His style is so different from everyone else, it makes sense for an off-world story. And I honestly wish he could have been a bigger part of this run, even if the way he illustrated Jean's freckles made it look like she'd been hit with shrapnel. But once again, there was that feeling of aimlessness with All New, and there were now only 2 issues left. I'd resigned to the fact that maybe there wasn't a real point behind this series, because there doesn't always need to be. Just before this, I'd read a run that prided itself on the very fact that it had no point, so why couldn't I apply the same rule here? And it all comes down to the potential that was shown. Prime example that I'm still kinda conflicted on, Jean outing Bobby as gay. Now I very much get why people get annoyed if you change the history of an established character, so I'm not going to be a shill and automatically praise it, but there was still something that Bendis could have done here. I don't know how this would have panned out, and the scene itself highlighted how it made no sense, but why wait until the 40th and penultimate issue to bring this up? Because, to give it credit, the moment itself is quite touching. Bobby's trait of always throwing out lewd and unnecessary comments was the catalyst for it, but Jean pins the reveal on her hearing his thoughts. You know, like she hasn't been a master of that skill for over 30 issues now. Had they given this more time, perhaps something could have been done with the difference in views on homosexuality during the 60s and the 2000s. Maybe even comment on how that gives them hope that one day being a mutant would be more accepted. But then again, if Cyclops' revolution had zero payoff, why would Bobby's sexuality? Speaking of which, what happened to Hank coming to the realization that humans will never change? Would this have gone somewhere if I'd read all of Black Vortex? Did Bendis leave it for someone else to deal with? Considering that the whole crux of this run hinged on the X-Men dividing over their views on how to be accepted within society, this felt like a huge realization for Hank to come to. Had it happened sooner, Cyclops could have taken him under his wing more. Imagine how the storyline would have panned out if Beast had brought his past self to the present and then had to go up against him. But nope, he's so unaffected by those thoughts that he spends an entire issue lying in the grass. Instead of furthering the characters that we have, Bendis closes all new with a story about the Utopians, a team of mutants who are hiding out on Utopia away from S.H.I.E.L.D. But when a recon team gets too close, the Utopians shoot down the ship, leading to Maria Hill asking for the all-new X-Men's help. And am I just dense because I had no clue who the Utopians were? There's not been a mention of them in this run, and I only recognised a few of the members in the first place, and their inclusion is so late on in this series that it means absolutely nothing. It's only good from the angle that it shows how much this younger team's grown. From Jean using her abilities to avoid fighting her fellow mutants, to Scott asking to be knocked out so that he doesn't hurt his friends, and even how they light a shield in the end. After a brief skirmish, the team realises they need to help the Utopians rather than fight them, so they tell Maria that they escaped when confronted, but instead they brought them to the Weapon X base so that they could feel safe from S.H.I.E.L.D. It's nice, it wraps this storyline up well, but I kept wondering if this was meant to happen earlier on. Biggest example of that, when the team arrive on Utopia, you've got characters like Scott and Jean asking about it as if they hadn't been there during Battle of the Atom. And I know a creator leaving a run doesn't have to mean the end of the series, so perhaps Bendis was setting something up for someone else to pick up on. That could be valid, except even if that was the case, Bendis is the guy who proved you could leave a title on a high and set up something fun for the next writer whilst he was on Daredevil. So either way, this all felt a bit flat, unless the ending of Jean wondering why things don't get better for mutants was being set up for another writer. He did say to be continued in Uncanny X-Men 600, so surely that must be the payoff. Or maybe this is just Bendis' thing now. Hank did it a few issues ago and it meant nothing. Maybe this is Jean's turn. And if this did go on for a few more issues, Bobby would probably think about it for a fleeting moment as well. They've come from a time where mutants are hated to another one half a century later where they're still seen as a threat, even if they exile themselves to an island meant for mutants. How did Bendis not explore that idea until it's the biggest one in all new? And I think it's more disappointing to see that squandered potential than if there was no sign it was there in the first place. Speaking of squandered potential, do you remember that cover where Havoc was strangling Cyclops? Well, that must have happened in issue 31.5 or something, otherwise known as Axis, an event written by Rick Remender that I completely forgot happened around this time. Long story short, a spell is cast that causes morality across heroes and villains to be flipped on their axis. See? That's why it had such a dumb title. Because of some of the conversations this prompted, Alex ended up leaving the Uncanny Avengers and reconciling with his brother, which was a really important moment. So no idea why there's not even a mention of it in the X-Men books. Instead, we just got a cover with no payoff, and the Marvel equivalent of the end battle of Scott Pilgrim.
What happened?
Oh, nothing. We just shot the shit. He's just a really nice guy. We're gonna get brunch next week. We actually have a lot in common.
I guess that's just another one of those interesting conflicts that Bendis won't cover. One of the only good things that comes out of this switch up is that both Alex and Emmett ask Cyclops the most important question that I've had since issue 1. Where was the revolution? I loved this, and I can't even tell you how much I loved this. Just two of the characters closest to him being like, what in the fuck did you even do? This comes about because Cyclops has realised it's time to answer for the wrongs that he's committed over the last few years. And without discussing it to anyone beforehand, he closes the Weapon X base and tells the students to go train at the Jean Grey school. And I didn't realise it until this moment, but over the course of this series you could see Cyclops losing his intimidation factor. In the earlier parts where I was complimenting how badass he was, those were the final moments of that persona that I was clinging onto. Because now, the guy even got taken out by golden balls. Fucking golden balls. From the very beginning, I questioned what the plan was to get this revolution off the ground, but maybe this entire time I should have been asking the same question as Emma and Alex. What even was the revolution? Where were the real moves to make a change rather than just cool statements and retaliation? I've said for a while I didn't know where this run had been going, but the one thing I'd hoped was a certainty was a big climax between Cyclops and the X-Men who opposed him, ended with a bang similar to the flawed but still enjoyable Battle of the Atom, rather than the whimper that we got here, because to me the only thing that's worse than setting up a plot for a few issues and not seeing it through is setting up a plot for a whole series and not seeing it through. There is a huge moment that leads to Emma leaving, which mirrored well against one of their fears where they outlined how they can work together. But this scene was a slap in the face for believing in their dynamic. All the talk about how he wouldn't touch her with Namor's trident, bitch, you were the one who broke her out in the first place. The real Emma wouldn't sit there and take that. She'd call him stupid for not realising that her powers had come back, lead this team of mutants on her own, and oust Cyclops from the team that he made to lead some actual revolution. Instead, we get a scene of Alex and Cyclops celebrating that she's gone. The issues of this are left. Because the thing that started this series is now done with, the next issue follows Kitty and Magic, who disappeared in the middle of Cyclops' argument with his students and instead go to Monster Island. Maybe this is what the all-new team meant when they said she was off planet. They're there to let out some anger, have Magic remind us yet again that she grew up in a hell dimension, and help a young mutant named Bo that has wound up there somehow. Now again, I don't just want to highlight the negatives, because this was a nice, wholesome issue between two characters that started off hating each other and on opposite sides. It doesn't have to care much about the continuity and was fun for the most part. There was even a sweet scene where they talk about how much they miss Colossus, and I remembered, I miss Colossus, but I would have enjoyed it more had this been before Cyclops disbanded his team, or just a side story in an annual, because since this is the issue immediately following Cyclops' announcement, it made it look like Magic couldn't care less. She was one of the first mutants to join up with him, someone who has fought literal monsters in the entirety of S.H.I.E.L.D. by his side. She was never scared of voicing her thoughts, so instead, she had the energy of somebody who's been sacked from a job that she was gonna quit anyway. Her and Kitty don't even have any qualms about taking Bo to the Jean Grey school. She checked out so much on Cyclops' vision that she will literally bring new mutants to the place she was trying to take students from in the first arc. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, because again, on the last page, just like in All New, it says to be continued in Uncanny X-Men 600, so maybe this is all just part of the plan. Except that 600 isn't even the next issue. Seriously, did Bendis not know what was coming out when? Instead, we get an issue in India where Cyclops has tracked down Mystique. She also asks the most important question about what's going on with the revolution, and Cyclops has the gall to say it would be going better if not for her, like, did she delete the plan that you had or something? I can give this a pass at least because it wasn't Cyclops, but Dazzler and the younger mutants setting her up. I did enjoy how she sussed out the imposter, and that would have been a better reveal if this issue wasn't interspersed with flashbacks of Dazzler on the helicarrier, talking about how she wants to get Mystique and Maria helps her build a plan. I'm a dumb reader, but Mystique saying it was an imposter clued me in enough, and maybe these last few issues of All New are just a continuation of the many epilogues in Battle of the Atom, because Bendis just seems to focus his time on cleaning up plots that he'd forgotten to deal with earlier. As a result, this felt like a really meh resolution to the whole thing with Mystique. She'd gone from building her own team in the shadows, framing the X-Men, taking over Madripoor, then falling by the wayside and being caught in a hotel room in India. Dazzler had a moment or two in the S.H.I.E.L.D. storyline, but she was mostly just a plot convenience for Mystique, to the point where I didn't really care if she got revenge. She herself had been in a coma for most of the run. Worse so, I've hardly been the biggest champion for them, but it was here that I realised just how little I cared about the New Mutants, because he assisted Dazzler in a setup. This prompts them to create their own team, but I could not care less where they end up going after this. But you know, a little cleanup here and there is fine for a run of this length. And again, it concludes with that line, to be continued in Uncanny 600, so the next issue's gonna be the big finale. Except that yet again, it's not. And I'm all out of free passes now because this issue was a direct continuation of the previous one. What if I loved the previous issue so much that I skipped to 600 to think it was going to be concluded there? I think I'm just a bit done with this series now. And for as much as I've bagged on these New Mutants, especially Fabio, the story of him debuting on the scene with his team, finding viral success and fame, and it all crashing down around him as quickly as it happened when the world found out he was a mutant, was fun to watch unfold. We're in the era where saying Hawk Tour can get you millions for some reason, so this felt like the most poignant story, and could have been explored somewhat with the 60s X-Men, rather than just having them go, whoa, isn't this weird? But this story did wrap up nicely, with the former Cyclops students accepting that they need guidance and turning to the Jean Grey school. In a way, it comes full circle, but I refuse to be fooled for a third time with that to be continued in Uncanny 600 cliffhanger. I've seen that 4 times now, and it's not gonna get me again, so I'm just gonna... There's a lot that you can do with 4 months. Travel most of Europe, sell your house and go through a really tedious mortgage process. You can also wait for Uncanny X-Men issue 600 if you were reading this as it was being released. Now, I want to dive into what the hell went on here. There are a few conspiracy theories that floated around, some of which centered around the idea that Marvel wanted to diminish the popularity of X-Men in the Fantastic Four to put pressure on Fox to relinquish the movie rights so that the 2 properties could join the MCU. In particular, they wanted to shift focus to the Inhumans, something Bendis even joked about when discussing his departure. There was another theory that the backlash to Bobby coming out caused Marvel to delay Bendis' final issue in order to take the heat off Iceman. Bendis once again addresses himself when speaking on the delays, but it's fun to look at the rhetoric of the time because the sole reason for the delay for once, was something that Bendis had zero influence over. In 2015, when Bendis was wrapping up his run on the X-Men, it was to coincide with Secret Wars, the huge event of that year which was written by Jonathan Hickman. However, the event was rife with delays, which not only impacted its own story, but every other series that had to line up with it. As far as I can tell, Bendis and everyone else who'd worked on the issue had submitted their completed pages so that it could be released a month after issue 35. But the conclusion to this series just sat in limbo until the 616 universe was ready to be reset. And the reason why I find it ironic and worth bringing into this review is because without that knowledge, you would be none the wiser from just reading issue 600. And I've been honest about runs like King's Batman and Spencer's Spider-Man to just have one excuse keep coming back to me: editorial interference. This right here, what happened with issue 600, is textbook editorial interference, and it still doesn't count as a get out of jail free card. Yeah, editorial does make a massive difference towards what makes it onto the page and what doesn't, but they aren't sat there going, this sounds like an amazing idea, so let's just get rid of it. A bad story or a bad run can simply just be a bad story or a bad run, and at the end of the day, all we're left with, regardless of the excuses and the reasons, is the book itself. So people need to stop saying editorial interference as if it makes the book any more enjoyable. The only exception to that is when it comes to Mad Dog merch. I'd been planning to relaunch designs to keep this channel going and had all these great ideas. It was perfect, you all would have loved it, until editorial got involved and now it just looks like this. Ah well, what can you do about it? If you guys believed me that this was a great idea before editorial got involved, then you can buy it for a massive discount over at maddogcomics.com, please. But when it comes to this final issue, at best, I can describe it as a collection of scenes that I'm glad I saw. At worst, I can say it reads like it was ghostwritten by someone who didn't know this was supposed to be an ending. We start off at the Jean Grey School, where Beast is summoned for a long overdue intervention, where it's finally acknowledged that he is the villain of this run. Okay, I'm paraphrasing a little. Beast is fully in denial despite everyone raising the points I spotted earlier, that Cyclops was just his scapegoat, he didn't bother to answer to anyone, and every future version of him we've seen is also evil. I get that he'd feel attacked, but Beast throws a tantrum about the whole thing and blames everyone else, so why not have this scene much earlier? It felt like this was needed shortly after Battle of the Atom, and then we could have seen where this led, but instead we just get a bunch of loose threads. Beast up and leaves the school in the middle of the night to God knows where, the younger students don't return to their time, and Cyclops assembles every existing mutant to Washington DC to say that this is the revolution, and still doesn't say what his plan is. When I was doing my research into this issue, one rumour that Bendis dispelled was that the delay also came with a reduction in pages, and I think that would have made sense, and from this scene alone, I think that's believable. While Cyclops is giving his speech, Magneto arrives in his badass black suit, tells Cyclops he's lost his mind, and that Xavier would be proud, and I guess that's all he wrote for the revolution. Now, I'm not the best storyteller, but hopefully that summary alone is enough to highlight how bitterly disappointing this final issue is. The two biggest plot points from the very beginning, with the 60s X-Men and Scott's revolution, are no further along than when they started. Worse so, Bendis only gives attention to the mess that he caused. The final speaking scene that Jean gets, she's levitated Hank high into the air after announcing she's leaving the X-Men, and the two kiss after saying that she does have feelings for him, all while Scott is watching from the ground. That's it. No follow-up with Scott, or even an acknowledgement that these two previously both seem to have some dangerous thoughts about humanity. There's not one single angle where I consider this to be a satisfying conclusion. The one thing that is somewhat resolved was the forced relationship that I thought was a huge mistake anyway. Scratch that, there is a second thing, which is the younger Bob is speaking with his older self about his sexuality. Yep, so those theories that the delay was because of this outrage couldn't have been more wrong, since Bendis doubled down on it. I do get Iceman's logic that he kept it secret for so long because he was struggling to be accepted as a mutant, and he was already having every aspect of his life being judged, so it was just better to hide. But this would be a speech that makes way more sense for the younger Bobby. Sure, I know there'll always be some kind of judgment going on, but as an outsider looking in, it must have been far more difficult to come out in the 60s than it would have been in the 2010s. But more importantly, how's Bobby even able to talk to himself? With it being clear that the younger team needed to return, and they don't do that in this issue, then where was the Bobby who becomes this Iceman? How hard would it have been to just have a scene of the younger team getting their minds wiped and returning to their time? That would have solved all of these problems. Or is Secret Wars just gonna erase them from this existence? One good thing about this final issue though, they brought back Colossus, even if it does make me wonder why they didn't earlier on in this run. It's mentioned that Kitty's getting married. I'd assume that was to Star-Lord, but you think they'd have a scene in her X-Men title where the people closest to her get to react to it. Unless that was a Black Vortex thing, then I'm okay missing it. Magic also gets a moment to reconnect with her brother, And honestly, this one did a lot to show her in a different light. She wasn't just this ambiguous, vague teleporter, but her interactions with the students throughout this series showed that soft side, and proved that she is as worthy to teach as any other. But besides that, this doesn't feel like an ending, let alone a satisfying one. I can't tell if Bendis leaving was his choice or part of the Marvel restructuring, but it felt like there was more left on the table than there was used. I couldn't find a ton of interviews about the run, but the goodbye note Bendis did clued me into what possibly could have happened here. And finally, it's over. Which is exactly the first thing you shouldn't say if you want it to sound like you enjoyed yourself. This is me inferring, but the whole thing read as if Bendis was relieved to be done with the X-Men, and that his ambitions were loftier than what he brought to the page. He talks about his connections to the team, and some of the things he's already done with these characters during House of M and AVX. It's almost as if those experiences made him believe that the only way to approach the X-Men was by making such big sweeping changes, like the No More Mutants moment or Cyclops killing Xavier. Yet maybe Bendis is better writing adjacent to the X-Men than he is writing about them, because what the X-Men needed at this time was stability, and the lack of conviction in any direction doesn't count towards that. This is my final verdict. And sometimes the greats fall. Thinking of my thoughts on this run as a whole, and looking at it with a decade since its original release, I can at least appreciate that Bendis was attempting to do some of the things that are commonplace in Marvel today. Whereas most now take us on a forced spiritual journey to understand the metaphysical meaning behind the title character, Bendis instead did that with a hokey time travel story that gave us a very literal comparison between who these characters were to show us how far they'd fallen. And in a way, I think that's why the biggest detractors of this run don't have a positive thing to say about it. It's not because it's a bad X-Men book or a bad Bendis book, but because of what we know it could have been. Maybe the exploration of Scott Summers isn't the most important thing that we can take from Bendis' time during the X-Men, but instead look at it as a key turning point in one of the careers of Marvel's most important creators. This review started with the intention of defending this run, finding the nuggets of greatness that got forgotten along the way, and I found some of them, but as the run continued, it became less about wanting to defend to trying to defend. And now with the run in my past, I'm wondering if it even needs to be. But if this very storyline was written all the way up until it became obsolete, then what's the point of it? The Marvel Universe didn't even want it to exist. And by trying to make this the most groundbreaking X-Men run that ever existed, and pushing the characters further than they've ever gone before, Bendis sentenced it to death because it was always going to remain unresolved. It refused to fold itself into the narrative, and as a result just remains this odd era, which is a shame for some of the great moments and ideas that often get forgotten about when you talk about this run, like the character work, the inclusion of X-23, the unlikely relationships it built, and just the dynamic that it had from day one. So whether the point of this video was to try and defend it, or to understand why no one talks about it, the answer seems to be in the fact that I even felt the need to ask those questions in the first place. And in a world where everything seems to need to be summed up as either the best thing ever or the worst, I think the reason that Bendis' X-Men faded so quickly into obscurity is because nobody can say that it's either.